being goes through, the embryonic mind, the dualic mind, the banausic mind, and the eristic mind, which Kenneth Smith equates to the mythic mind. We've been talking about how this relates to Hegel's concepts of Begriff and Vernunft, and Begriff and Verstand and Vernunft, right? The three different kind of modes of thinking. We've been, oh yeah, Jordan Peterson and Joseph Campbell come up a fair amount. Welcome to the call, Van Hoyen. We're mostly talking about Kenneth Smith's book, Millennia and Microcosm, and we're focusing in on his description of the ancient worldview and how it differs from the medieval and the modern. And we've been looking at this concept which Hegel picked up and ran with, which goes back to Aristotle and Heraclitus and others, that the human mind is intended to develop through a number of stages, just like there are life stages physically in the body, the embryonic stage, the infantile stage, the child stage, the adolescent stage, and adulthood, and so forth. And they're discrete, and they're distinguishable, and the brain is involved, at each stage of development in doing different things. In the same way that we accept that physically, this Greek / Hegelian / existentialist model argues that the human mind also is intended to go through a series of stages of development, that's what we've evolved to do. So, and that these are based on kind of the balance of focus among the different basal faculties of the mind of Homo sapiens and how it works. So we've had 75 of these sessions so far. And it has gotten us through chapter 4, and a lot of it's been in chapter 4, especially focusing on this concept that to the Greeks, mythos and mythos culture are not primitive forms of logos or logos culture. That is, contrary to the modern perspective, which argues that myths are defective scientific theorems. The ancient Greeks believed, actually, on the contrary, scientific theorems are trivial, literalizing, intellectualizing, logicizing explanations for discrete phenomena in an abstract way, whereas what mythoi are attempting to describe are something far more complicated than that. They're trying to explain how it is that so much of the way we live in our, the course of our lives is determined not by facts, but by our innate character, and how that character responds when it interacts with the contingencies of life and history, as we sort of pinball our way through, interactions with other people or with gravity or, the other things that we come into. Each of us responds differently based on our character, what Heraclitus referred to as our inner nature, which has its own laws of development, every bit as much as the external world does with, gravity and electricity and so on. And that mythoi are focusing on those inner laws of character and how they manifest. So the attempt is to go beyond sort of abstract arm-wavy generalizations about the mind and describe this kind of structure of the mind and its development that the ancients took for granted, that they didn't write about a lot because they all sort of knew it about each other. They didn't. It's in the same way there are lots of things that moderns don't talk about that we take for granted as being part of the modern world. There's a lot of things that the ancients didn't talk about that they take for granted as being part of the ancient world. And for us, those unwritten things, or let's say sparsely written things, are the most interesting parts, because those are the parts where you get at how different the world looked to an ancient than it looks to a modern. So if we look at an ancient Greek myth that's, includes some explanation of physical phenomenon, to a scientist like Carl Sagan, when he's narrating in the TV series Cosmos, that shows to him, that proves that a myth is a primitive scientific theorem and that it does a bad job because it doesn't represent reality very well. And thank God we've gotten away from myths, which are all lies and falsehoods. And now we have science, and science gives us truths. This is the modern framework for interpreting what the ancient world was about. We say that they're primitive versions of ourselves. But to the ancients, that's not what a myth was for. If it talks about some fantastical explanation for the sun or the moon or gravity, that's not the point of the myth. We think it's the point because we're mapping scientific theories onto myths, but it's not the point for them. For them, the point is to explore this concept of the complex relationships in life between agency and contingency. What's under our control and what's not under our control? To what extent do we have choice in how our lives turn out, and to what extent are we running up against, great forces and powers in the world that are going to have their way whether we like it or not? And where myth gets subtle and profound, which is something that's really obscure to moderns, is when it says some of those forces and powers are not external things like gravity. Some of them are internal things, like somebody's drive to become famous, where they're need to defeat their father or what have you, and how, for example, a squabble between Agamemnon and Achilles can have dire life and death consequences on the plains of Troy. That what's determining the outcome in that case isn't electricity or gravity or something else you could stick a number on. It's Agamemnon's need to dominate his soldiers and Achilles' need not to be dominated, and how far each of them is willing to go in tearing apart their alliance, in order to satisfy the drive of their character. This is complex stuff. It's not primitive baby science the way that we always talk about it. It's something else entirely. And it's trying to learn by studying examples and trying to find paradigmatic examples that are so memorable and in which the consequences are so clear that if you share that story, you're going to educate a lot of people about things they ought to look out for in their own character and in the characters of the peoples around them. And so this is the crux of this section that we're in, section F in chapter 4, mythos and logos, where we're upending the modern definition of mythos, and we're coming to understand it as this kind of psych, suke logos, a kind of exploration of the logos of the suke. What is the structure of our mind and character? Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was wondering about the relationship of Freud to Carl Jung. I know Jung was a disciple of Freud until he broke from Freud. It seems to me Freud is also talking about the psyche, but the psyche in some sense was internalized into the unconscious. But I don't know if Freud ever connected to nature, but it is this psychological dimension that's, let's say, separate from the let's say crawling out of the cave. And it was about civilization and discontent, that there's a struggle, a tension between the subconscious and the conscious mind, and thereby the discontent, because the psychological factors, in a sense, clash against the mask of civilization. Whereas Jung took that, to me, seemed like back to a little bit more of a Greek model, maybe even beyond the Greeks, that of the collective unconscious, so that in a sense it originated in some deep way in relationship to probably a relationship with nature, but it's embedded within the structure of human beings and arises. And so there's a circular movement, it seemed to me, in Jung that wasn't quite there in Freud. Freud was a kind of clash of culture, if you want to put it that way. So could you say something about that? It seems like as a modern reenactment of that whole thing about, first a discontent from modernity as separating the unconscious, and then a kind of a reintegration. Because that might enlighten us that, in a sense, that was never quite lost, despite everything. So,
Yeah, it's interesting because literary critic Harold Bloom wrote a whole book asserting that Freud discovered psychotherapy by reading Shakespeare's plays.
mm-hmm.
And at first, on the surface, that sounds like crazy talk because, as we know, science comes from science. It doesn't come from literature. How could psychology have come out of drama? But when we think about the fact that drama among the Greeks arose as a sacred tradition within the worship of Dionysus. And the purpose of drama was to expose the unconscious parts of the mind and put them visible on the stage so that we could learn from them. Then it starts to sound a lot less crazy. We know that Shakespeare read a lot of his predecessors' plays. We know he was inspired by Holinshed's Chronicles and Plutarch's Lives and others. So he's drawing off of sources that go way back and that have some continuity all the way back to the Greek theater tradition. And the Greek theater tradition is rising out of this kind of mythos culture of saying that what a culture needs to focus on is, why do people do the things that they do, and how can we cultivate people to try to help them develop in a healthier, more productive direction, be less antagonistic to each other. But this is an awfully indirect route. So Freud's examinations of these things are going to necessarily be filtered through his Victorian Viennese sensibilities, rather than be any kind of direct translation of the past into the present. And certainly Jung thought that Freud was so focused on sexuality and sexual repression, which, not that they're not important, but he was so focused on that aspect of Victorian civilization that he was underplaying other aspects of the unconscious. So in some ways, Jung is trying to create a more whole-minded approach to figuring out, what is work going on in the dark in our minds, what, beyond just the simple steam engine of repressed sexuality that Freud focused on. So out of that, it's gonna mean you're gonna get a very different flavor of psychotherapy from the two explorers. It's not surprising that they manifest differently the way that they do. And it's interesting the extent to which, Jung's attempts to go beyond sexuality and look into the whole range of unconscious factors results in, with his archetypes idea, it's almost like a kind of polytheism, right? That he's doing. Instead of the monotheism of the one repressed sexual god, it becomes the polytheism of many unconscious things, repressed or not, that are affecting us, and how much of that do we have in common with each other, with his idea of the collective unconscious. Now, whether you buy the idea that represents some kind of unconscious telepathy among human beings, creating the collective unconscious, or whether you think it is natural to the human condition that, existing in this world the way we do, certain kinds of challenges and concerns are going to naturally arise, and that would cause us to converge on some kind of unconscious polytheism. There's a lot of different ways to read Jung. So I'm not giving you a definitive answer. And, frankly, I need to read more Jung. I read a lot of Jung when I was a teenager, and I haven't read him as an adult. And the result of that is, I've got blank spots in my appreciation. A lot of that's filled in with pop culture interpretations of Jung rather than with Jung himself. So I owe him a reconsideration. So thanks for bringing him up. Van Huyn and then Ginny. Go ahead, Van Huyn. Come off mute.
Hey, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
My question would be this. So if I may just share for a minute, and then I would love to hear your response, Rick. I saw some debates between Jordan Peterson and those like Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris. In addition to that, I remember Carl Sagan. I'm a science teacher now, but I have a philosophy background. And in many ways, the real tension is that when people have meta narratives or these kind of grand narratives in mythology, it allows them to have a map of where they are, where they came from, where they're going. But as we've become increasingly scientific and rational in our thought, there's this idea that these are just mere superstitions. But at the same time, the things that we've discovered in science have been very bleak. Things like we've discovered entropy. We've discovered that evolution has largely wiped out 99.9% of species. We've discovered many, many things about our narratives that have largely gone against life. And so in many ways, Jordan Peterson speaks a lot about Nietzsche. I'm almost finished, but I'd like your thoughts on this, Rick. How Nietzsche believed that science was meant to serve life rather than life serving science. And where I'm getting at is every time Jordan Peterson would try to make a point against Matt Dillahunty basically would say something along the lines of, you know, your ideas about myth, your ideas about narratives, if we can test it, then it's valid. If we can't test it, then that's superstition. So unless you can prove it to me right now, what is your point, Jordan? And I've noticed this type of tension. Any thoughts, Rick?
Yeah, this is something Kenneth Smith writes about a lot in this and other books. He talks about the way that the modern approach to science doesn't, first of all, the modern approach to science doesn't necessarily reflect the whole range of possibilities for how science should behave. You know, we have to be careful to look at what is the actual science that's taking place as opposed to what's the philosophy of science that we wish we were practicing. So, for example, it's not part of the philosophy of science that our investigations into nature should be constrained based on who can you convince to fund you. And funding plays the major role, the dominant role in modern forms of science. Who gets funding and who doesn't has a lot to do with who's asking questions that lead a wealthy funder to believe that they can make enormous amounts of money if they fund this particular investigation. And of course, as we know, a great deal of the most important scientific breakthroughs didn't come from directed science. They came from undirected science. There were things that were discovered accidentally, account for an enormous amount of the things that we depend on in our lives. So there's a massive distortion in the structure of science today and how it's practiced that has to do with, you know, do people believe in advance that this particular question will lead to profit? And if it doesn't, then it doesn't get funded. Now, the result of that is that the way that we practice science today has this accounting mechanistic quality to it that most serious philosophers of science would say is not supposed to be part of the core of science. Core of science is supposed to be, you know, if we go back to the late Roman era, if we go to the kind of Arab Renaissance way back when, we see that the purpose of science was to filter out the many, many plausible but false rational ideas by using the world and its behavior as a test and saying, you know, well, okay, Plato, this particular line of argument sounds really good, but what happens if we actually try that out? Oh, look, it doesn't happen. So I guess that's not real. Now, if we do that, we find that, you know, among the pre-Socratics, there's this wide range of descriptions of how the world might work, but most of them don't hold up if you actually test them against science. So that idea that reason has this flaw, rationality and logic have this flaw, that you can create valid constructs that follow all the rules of a perfectly valid logical syllogism and yet arrive at a conclusion that has nothing to do with reality, that's false, and that's a problem that needs to be solved. This is where science tries to harness together the rationality of what Kenneth Smith calls noesis, the systematizing, abstractivizing mind, tries to leash it to the whole forming, concrete, tangible faculty of gnosis, which is about experience in the world and paying attention to what actually is happening rather than to the brilliant ideas we have. So the way that, if that's the intent of science, if we look at the distorting effects of the marketplace on science as it manifests in the modern age, we see that science is pulled farther away from gnosis, away from a whole-minded exploration of the world, and more in the direction of very linear, kind of prescriptive, aspectival, fragmented investigations of the questions that we think are going to lead to short-term profit. And the result of that is noesis is given the upper hand. We're more focused on this sort of kind of, what do we want to say, dissecting, analyzing, quantifying side of science, and we leave in sort of, we neglect, shall we say, the whole forming kind of system, what do we want to say, whole ecological systematic thinking that says, okay, it's fine that you've identified pieces, but what happens when they start working together? Like, you know, things that chaos theory looks into, things that ecological science looks into, things that complexity theory looks into, you know, these sort of things that we're starting to investigate kind of belatedly show that there are whole aspects of the human existence that can't be explained just by breaking things down to the smaller and smaller Legos that can only be seen in the complex interactions and interrelationships between things. So this is where you sort of run into the difficulty between logos culture and mythos culture. In an overly noeticized, market-driven science will tend to give us a logos culture noetic interpretation of the world, whereas a more whole-minded science that includes more gnosis would give us a greater ability to represent these more complex aspects of life and the human condition. But they would do so at the price of being able to introduce, well, let's put it a different way, of being able to not be 100% obsessed with quantitative description, but being more able to discuss qualitative information, because, you know, these kind of large psychological, cultural, relational aspects of life are things that we don't know how to measure. And it may be that they are unmeasurable because there's too many things that would have to be measured to add up to the whole system. It may be that qualifying, using the use of metaphor, categories, properties, descriptions, relationships, processes, that these may be the only way that we're able to capture these parts of life. So, you know, the debate that you're talking about involves this tug of war over whether, you know, science is going to be allowed to include the qualitative large scale parts of life, or whether it's going to be forced forever into sort of this tiny nutshell of, you know, things that we can count and number. It's a great question. Ginny, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. You're still on mute, Ginny.
Yeah, actually, I guess we're not allowed to respond as the conversation is happening, because I'm going back one conversation ago when you were talking about drama, plays, and theater and psychology, and I thought, oh, that's an extra.
Go ahead.
Extra interest there, and I agree. I mean, playwrights, what they've produced and contributed, it certainly has a lot of psychology, absolutely. So that did give me an extra peak of interest. So that's all.
Yay! Thanks, Ginny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes sense given your background. That would.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's taken us a certain number of weeks to really dig through the what Kenneth Smith might be talking about when he says the mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic. But with that in place, I think that we could make pretty rapid progress through the text now and really see what he's talking about here. Sorry, Phil, did you have something you wanted to add before we go back to the text?
Yeah, I do. I guess I want to ask you to say something more about the archive, because there seems to, I'm thinking maybe archive is the right word. There seems to be a difference between episteme and archive, because it seems to me to what degree does one need to know something in order to, in a sense, understand something deeper, which is wisdom? There's always a conflict between knowledge and wisdom, because on the one hand, it does seem like knowledge is necessary for wisdom, but not the same as wisdom. And it seems to me that knowledge is a knowledge of somehow measuring things in a very narrow focus layer, and wisdom is broader. So maybe if you could explain in a deeper way, at least to my understanding, what the archive is, maybe that contrast would help us in a technical sense to understand the difference between the specific technical issues versus the more general, comprehensive understanding.
Yeah, of course.
Please go over that again, because that seems like really important.
Yeah, it's highly relevant here. Thanks, Phil. So, you know, I think the way Kenneth Smith would pose this is that, well, first of all, I've always loved his definition of philosophy. which is that every other subject gives you something new to think about, but only philosophy gives you something new to think with. And that applies to the difference between knowledge and wisdom as well. Knowledge satisfies the modernist conception of intelligence and virtue, which is that ignorant, subjective people are not virtuous, but educated, objective people are virtuous. We have this belief that the process of turning, 2-year-old toddler savages into civilized adults consists of popping the top open on their head and just pouring in information. And over time, they become more knowledgeable, and that makes them better people. And of course, the problem with that model is it can't explain how the most scientifically advanced country in the world, which was Germany in the 1930s and 40s, could be the one that did the Holocaust and started world wars. I mean, if adding knowledge makes you good, then the Germans in 1930 should have been the best people in the world, because they were, far more advanced on these things than the United States or Britain or anywhere else. But instead, that didn't work. And part of the flexing that happened between mid-stage and late-stage modernity was right during the 20th century. And part of it was that very issue. And you can see the flexing with the way that there's been a return towards seeing the importance of values education. It's not implemented yet, but it's talked about a lot. The importance of trying to raise people to not just be soulless mechanics who will make any kind of powerful machine for anybody and not ask why. That we don't want to do that anymore. That we want our technical capacity to be matched by an ethical maturity that helps us to figure out whether or not we should be building a nuclear bomb for Nazi Germany or not. I mean, these kinds of things are starting to come more to the forefront, and yet we still have refused to revise this model of education, right? We still, if you look at No Child Left Behind, we're still largely teaching just the facts, ma'am, and can you memorize them and regurgitate them on a test? We still are imposing this now discredited model of education and virtue, that if we could just prove that enough people have reached a certain floor level of education, then surely goodness shall follow. And that's despite the fact that we have, the most dramatic possible evidence that that's not the case. So the difference between knowledge and wisdom has to take into account that where we stand in history and this struggle on this very issue about what does more knowledge mean. This problem was apparent to the ancient Greeks. I mean, of the small number of fragments that we still have left from Heraclitus, one of them says, much learning does not teach understanding. Otherwise, it would have taught, and then Heraclitus gives a list of people he's discrediting, who are very well educated but don't understand anything very well. Elsewhere, he makes clear he has a seekers after wisdom. So seekers after gold have to turn up much soil, and seekers after wisdom should be acquainted with a great number of things. So he believes that knowledge and education are important, but he also believes that knowing more stuff doesn't necessarily make you wise. In fact, most highly educated people are fools. Heraclitus, is often called a misanthrope for this reason. He has a skeptical take on the status quo. He says, wisdom is knowing how all things are steered through all things. That's another one of his fragments. And the steering part, Kubernetes, like cybernetic, is the term. He's referring to the archive that you asked about. Because in this archaic Greek model of nature, the surface phenomena of nature are being generated by these fountains of order, these archai, these deep principles that are not initially coordinated with each other. They each push in their own direction. But as they push, they have to grapple with and relate to each other. And they start producing higher level phenomena. And thus you get this situation where at a pretty young age, any child can recognize a tree despite the fact that no two trees are identical. We can see somehow a pattern emerging that's the result of the interactions of deep archai, and that interaction happens over and over and over in all kinds of different places. even though we can't quantify it because it won't stay pinned down, because it's different in every expression, in every circumstance. It comes out in a different way. Wisdom has to do with, from the Kenneth Smith perspective, which draws off this existentialist tradition. Wisdom has to do with getting past knowledge about how to do things. Between measuring things and collecting data, it has to get through, but past that, to the level at which you start to see the deep principles underlying everything. Why do things manifest the way that they do? You start to appreciate, for example, the law of unintended consequences. The fact that when a finite being interacts with an infinite world, there are going to be mistakes every single time. You're never going to have things perfectly under control, because to have things perfectly under control, you'd have to know everything. Ceteris paribus, all else being equal. The only way to assure that all else is equal is to know all else, and no human being will ever know all else. The cosmos is far too big for that. So there is this art of navigating the uncomfortable human condition of being required to take action, but also being prevented from taking the exactly right action ever, because we'll never know what the exactly right action is. We'll only have these approximations. And so we end up having to, because we're not able to, I think about, these chess programs that beat people because they look ahead at all the possible combinations and they pick the best one. And so they're just mechanically going through all of the end states. And they can only do that because chess is so simple. And the problem we have is the universe is so complex, and we live such a short time, we'll never have the possibility of running through all of the end states and picking the best option. And so instead, we find ourselves having to arrive at better solutions through this process of approximation, not based on the surface details, but based on the underlying principles or archi that are creating those surface details. That allows us to account for things that we haven't seen and measured, but that we can expect to be present in some form, even though we haven't put our fingers on it yet. So this is it. This wisdom kind of deals in this invisible art, kind of what Heraclitus calls the hidden harmony.
Sounds a lot like Osiris and Seth to me.
There's a lot of Osiris and Seth in this. Yes.
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 Okay. I'll end there, but yeah.
Yes. And before I call on Stephen to address Van Hoyen's comment in the chat, he asks, could we say that wisdom equals scalable? In fact, that's part of what wisdom is about. It wouldn't equate them, but certainly that wisdom gives you a way to account for the things that you haven't seen, but that you have every reason to expect to be present anyway. If the more you get to know the underlying principles, the more you know it's unlikely that this situation I'm trying to, make some predictions about, it's unlikely that it wouldn't involve some kind of influence from this other principle. And so, wisdom gives me the possibility of taking it into account. That means where the scalability comes in, that you can make reasonable approximations, even in systems that are so complex, you could never get there deterministically by accounting for all the factors. So there's a scalability built into it. It's tricky stuff to pin down. Stephen, go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was going to say, since the issue of Dillahunty was brought up, I've been looking into that debate between Peterson and Dillahunty. Now, effectively, Peterson snubbed Dillahunty, and Dillahunty was very upset about that. But some of the stuff Dillahunty came up with, like he was criticising Peterson for being on his steak trip. Peterson was only going to eat steak. He was doing the Paleolithic or whatever it was. Dillahunty's going, oh, that guy came in, he didn't eat any vegetables. He just wanted to fry a steak and some salt. And I'm thinking, my God, yeah, I saw this guy eating pizza. It's criminal. look, please, Dillahunty, you're destroying your own credentials with that one. But yeah, when Peterson said to him, you're all Christians, his head explodes. And he can't figure it out. And I'm dumb, but I can figure it out. Dillahunty, you've told everybody you were a voracious Christian when you were young. Your values were formed by that. You didn't suddenly, just simply because you became an avowed atheist, you don't lose all that baggage. It's still with you. This was the point, of course, that Nietzsche was making, that, yeah, you've disavowed God, when he was making, the point of the madman, but you're still living off the old Christian baggage. You believe that your moral values can survive without Christianity. And Nietzsche's making the point that your moral values were strongly influenced by Christianity. And the further and further you go from the source, the further and further you risk going into nihilism. But the rational world refuses to accept that. They can't understand that you're like a rock that's been heated up and you're going to be warm for a while, even though the source of heat is gone. But one day that rock's going to cool down. That was Nietzsche's claim. He claimed a lot of things. Something which I felt was one of his most important claims was, well, I felt this answered a lot of questions for me. He said that the modern academic is ridiculously superficial. That is their huge problem. They've got all the equipment, they've got all these massive universities, blah, blah, blah. But Nietzsche's pointing out that's precisely what has weakened them. They've got we've got the car, we don't have to walk. Our muscles, our intellectual muscles have grown weak. And I mean, approaching philosophy, and especially approaching somebody like Kenneth Smith, is painful. You're going into an intellectual gym. You're trying to build muscles that have atrophied. People don't understand that. They think that you can get an easy trip. This is what the modern world's about. We want stuff the easy. We want to be spoon-fed. We want to be given stuff the easy way. But unfortunately, you don't build your intellectual muscles that way.
Right.
Thank you. But I did bring up a point early in the chat. And yeah, this other point, just because they were a people culturally predisposed to seek fundamental principles or archive.
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering, you have sort of talked about this often, and I would like more expansion. Can such a statement be justified? Not that I'm doubting it, but what are the justifications for that statement? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah. Well, that was a lot of interesting material there. And I was going to comment on a lot of it, except that the question you asked last has displaced all of it in my head. So I may or may not come back to some of it later. But I will share, okay, yeah, it's the belief that everything is supposed to be easy, that we have a right to an easy life, and that includes our intellectual life. Everything should be pre-digested and handed to us. And if we have to work for it, then that's not okay. It must be wrong. Anything we have to work for is false in some way. We sense its falsehood through the difficulty. We say, well, I don't find that. You see this all the time in modern intellectual arguments. That doesn't persuade me. I don't find it persuasive. And that's presented as though that has any kind of binding on reality. And so what if you don't find it persuasive? Reality doesn't care if you find it persuasive. Reality is real whether you like it or not. So this kind of tendency to prefer pre-digested ideas that are all just laid out for you as a pablum that you can spoon in and then you can regurgitate to get an A on your test. Kenneth Smith calls this lappy. We want things laid in our laps for us. We don't want to stand up. We'll just sit here in our armchair and you do all the work and you pre-chew all the food for us and lay it out in little bowls and set it on a plate on our lap. And that's, and the people have this lappy expectation. And he says, just what you said, that you are not going to be prepared to deal with the difficult issues of life if you expect everything to be pre-chewed for you. So he made a conscious decision. I think he said it was, Donald can correct me if I'm wrong, I think Kenneth said it was after his university career, when he started working as an independent philosopher, he made a conscious choice to redesign his entire lexicon and his way of using language, so that instead of trying to offer easy text that was unable to grapple with difficult issues, he redefined his vocabulary to make sure that he would be able to deal with difficult issues. He could say the things that other people couldn't say, and that would cost him a major part of his audience, but that it was worth it because those were issues that nobody was talking about, because everybody was uniformly running towards lappy topics, anything you could say on a bumper sticker or a campaign button. So to go to the question that you asked at the end, just because they were a people culturally predisposed to seek fundamental principles or archi. This is a quote out of I think it's section F, but certainly out of chapter 4. We're talking about the ancient Greeks. Why do they have this, what Phil was talking about, this concept of wisdom that deals with archi? Why is that their go-to place for explaining wisdom? Why, for example, don't they take a modernist approach, which is that wisdom means knowing how to make a buck, right? Wisdom is pragmatism. Wisdom is, how do I get what I want? This is what we think wisdom is. And we expect a certain amount of cloaking in the vestments of wisdom. It's nice if it comes with a cross or with an old man on a mountaintop with a beard, who makes cryptic gestures. But we still think that ultimately pragmatism is the real wisdom. And that's because we are not predisposed to seek fundamental principles or archi. As a people, we are the opposite of the ancient Greeks in the way that he's describing it here. So what does he mean by this? Why would they be culturally predisposed to seek fundamental principles or archi? Well, there's a couple of things. The first is that polytheism, as an approach, encourages people to be able to hold multiple conflicting ideas in their head at the same time, in a way that monotheism rarely does. Monotheism has a tendency to lend itself to genocide. It leads people to think there's one right way. By amazing coincidence, it's my way. I just happen to be born with the right language and the right religion and, hey, the right skin color and who knows how many other things. Oh, I'm the right sex. It's like, yay me. There's a tendency towards simple-mindedness that goes with monotheism. And frequently during the transition from polytheism to monotheism, it in fact formed a central part of the arguments against polytheism. Oh, that's too messy and complicated. And you're dividing up all the powers of the cosmos among all of these sort of half-pint gods, each of whom is the god of some part. Our God is the God of everything. And that means he's a better God than your God. It takes 12 of your gods to add up to one of my gods. So my God's better. So this kind of notion of the law of the excluded middle, there's a right and there's a wrong, and your way is the wrong way and my way is the right way. This all comes with monotheism. And it leads people towards thought-terminating cliches. It leads people towards shallow, superficial analyses. It's not that you can't be a deep thinker and be a monotheist. It's that you have to swim against the stream, right? And plenty of people have. But, it was an effort, right? They had to push against tendencies towards orthodoxy to engage in deep thought. But in polytheism, it's just, speaking of lappy, in polytheism, the idea that there might be complexities and conflicts among different powers, that's the opening argument of polytheism. That's not something you have to fight to arrive at as a conclusion. It's where they begin. They're like, yeah, Athena and Ares don't get along very well. Ostensibly, they both have something to do with battle, but at the same time, they hate each other. And Ares is about the reveling and relishing in warfare, and Athena is about personal excellence and the warrior as the person who is attempting to overcome their limitations and rise to Aristeia. These are conflicting The whole I want to march in columns and follow orders is in conflict with I want to rise to become the best possible version of myself. And so to the Greeks, it was obvious that the universe isn't made up of one simple homogeneous design imposed from without by somebody who knew everything and could lay out the whole plan. It seemed obvious to them that it was the consequence of complicated, conflicting interactions among different sources of organization that were all functioning in parallel. Complexity sort of on the surface of a polytheistic approach. I don't think that's the only reason that they were culturally predisposed as a people to look for fundamental principles or archai, but it's certainly the easiest explanation. You can see it right there. It's built into the structure of their religion. And it's part of the reason we've talked about this before, but since Van Huyn wasn't here before, I'll just mention it again. It's one of the most dramatic and conspicuous differences between the ancient epoch and the medieval epoch. That in the medieval epoch, the approach to religion was all other religions must be exterminated. All of them, they all have to go. Only my one religion can survive. And so I'm going to have crusades, and we're going to have inquisitions, and it's going to be the cross or the sword, convert or die. We're going to do everything we can because we believe that our way is the right way, and if everybody will convert to our way, then we can have world peace. Then the world will be a beautiful, godly place. But the ancient Greeks didn't do that. And it's hard for us to, even with so much testimony as with Herodotus and Xenophon and Thucydides and others, just laying out the story clearly before us, it's still hard for us to accept that the ancient Greeks, when they encountered another religion, their first reaction wasn't to feel threatened by it. They didn't feel like they had to get rid of it. There was no convert or die impulse to speak of when their religion interacted with other religions. Their immediate impulse was to understand it and search it for fundamental principles or archai that religion captured better than the Greek religion. And whenever they found an example of that, they would borrow from that religion and take it into their own, because they thought the purpose of their religion wasn't to be an unchanging statement of an orthodox truth that must be stamped across everybody's mind over the whole world. They thought their religion was the result of an exploration into nature, a vast, complex realm that exceeds human understanding, in an attempt to map out what the most important archai are that every human being should be made aware of and keep track of. So they were always on the watch for somebody to have seen something they hadn't seen so that they could borrow it and bring it in. It's hard to comprehend how different that is from either what the medievals would have done or what we would do in the modern age. We're still genocidal. We still believe, our way of life should replace all other ways of life. There should be one unified marketplace. We should either one world government, or there can be many governments, so long as they're all more or less the same thing. We don't care, but they all have to be the same. There can't be anything too weird, too alien. And some of us are still trying to fight for medieval theocracies. The ones who are atheist almost all believe in the same kind of, I don't know what the next step beyond monotheist is, a neo-theist, right? I've decided there's no God, so you shouldn't have a God either, and I need to spread my orthodoxy of atheism to everybody, and if only everybody will stop believing in gods and adopt my way of seeing the world, then we'll have world peace and surely goodness shall follow. The same medieval crap goes on in the modern world, this kind of simple-minded, lappy, literalist, monomaniacal, to use Freudian terms, obsession with purification and elimination of diversity. And you can see, the more you look at these examples, how different the ancient Greeks were. And even the Romans, nobody would think of the Romans as a tolerant, diverse people by comparison with the ancient Greeks. And yet whenever they conquered an area, they would help pay to set up temples to whatever the local gods were of the people they conquered. They didn't tell them, you all have to convert to our religion. They'd say, sure, you have to buy into our pantheon and you have to respect our emperor, but you can keep all your own gods too. And that's the Romans. So the ancients generally had this quality that they were open to the idea of bringing in other observations about the world that might lead you to a deeper understanding of the principles or archaic work. So I think that's the answer And at least that's an initial answer to your question. It's a great question. I think we could do a whole series of sessions for a month or more on other reasons why the ancient Greeks were also culturally predisposed. There's a lot more at work than that. And part of it has to do with, I'm not going to get into it, but I am going to allude to it just to give a hint that I'm not airily waving in the direction that there might be more things. There are more tangible, specific things. Gilbert Murray in 5 Stages of Greek Religion talks about how the Greek religion grew into the Olympian pantheon that we know it as. And a big part of that had to do with the different Hellenic tribes worshiping different deities. And somehow they had to weld themselves together into a unified fighting force. They had to create the cosmos of the phalanx. You know, they had to, if they couldn't do that, then they couldn't spread and conquer the way that they wanted to as a Indo-European people. And so they had to tolerate extreme differences of religion among their neighbors from themselves so that they and their neighbors could form a fighting force together. So there's a way in which the tribalism and the desire to become a stronger military force led directly to the polytheism. So that's one of the things he talks about there. If you're interested in the subject, you know, Gilbert Murray's 5 Stages of Greek Religion is very readable. And that guy knew how to write. And it's on Kenneth Smith's recommended book list. So, all right, why don't I come off, Van Hoyen, can you come off mute and share us what's on your mind?
Yeah, if I may share a couple thoughts about this. So if I understand Jordan Peterson correct, I know this is going towards Jordan Peterson, but it does relate to the topic in general. So Jordan Peterson has never really stated explicitly what he really believes about God. But if I had to make some extrapolations, my understanding of his idea of God is that if we were to extract the best qualities of the best kind of people, then over time we reify an abstraction of the best kind of person. We start to develop exemplars. So in Jordan Peterson's mind, the idea would be is that this starts to narrow down what kind of exemplars we might have. So in his case, he has various exemplars, but he believes that Jesus Christ would be a very good exemplar. Now, again, Peterson has been very intentional not saying what he believes about God, but when he says things like, well, you say you don't believe in God, but you really do act like you believe in God. His idea is that people act as though there's an ideal. And in our current rational scientific age, largely with systems like evolution and a lot of scientific materialism, the idea of an ideal has largely gone away. So when people act as though there's an ideal, that there's an exemplar to emulate, that there's something that we can become that can really be our best expression of ourselves, that's what Peterson seems to be saying when he talks about God. Now, in this case, it might not be so much monotheism, it might be something called a perennialist philosophy. But the basic idea would be that if we did have like a polytheism, which, you know, I think Peterson has talked about various iterations of this, people could very much start to have a lack of commitment. They can become very weaselly about which type of exemplar they decide to emulate. So if someone decided to say, you know what, there's a bunch of different gods, I decide that I'm going to emulate Satan, or I'm going to emulate Shiva. I'm going to go around and just destroy things and recreate things, versus an exemplar that very much could be about compassion, love, like the Buddha, Jesus Christ, types of consciousnesses that seem to scale over time. So when we talk about things like wisdom, I'm thinking about Kant, who had this idea that we can seem to come up with pretty good categories for saying how much can we try to universalize this. Of course, it wasn't perfect because there were some problems with the categorical imperative, but the basic idea would be, rather than just think about the short term, can we find something that's scalable that we can connect over time? So for example, if someone were to say something like, well, our friendship basically is, if I can punch this person in the face and take $1 million, that's the extent of the friendship. But they aren't really thinking about a friendship that could scale over time. They just think, I just took this money and ran away with it, and that's the extent of how much I value friendship. Well, that's just not going to scale because we couldn't connect it over time. It couldn't be universalized. If everyone did this, we'd have total chaos in the world, and only psychopaths would largely win. And then after that, the whole thing would collapse. So that wouldn't really be wise. And so I think the basic idea would be, given our, just to summarize, given our current scientific understanding of the world, which can be very bleak in many ways, we've lost the idea of the ideal. And the idea behind a lot of myth would be that we still have an ideal. In many ways, if you can just give me about 30 more seconds, he talked about psilocybin in that conversation with Matt Dillahunty. And the idea behind this rational framework is that there's kind of this linear way that we can do science and come to really good conclusions. But Jordan Peterson talks about how we have like a left side of our brain and a right side of our brain, and that as soon as we take psilocybin, it gets us away from this linear way of doing things that activates sides of our brain that are highly irrational. But it opens up different possibilities for us to actually be more functional rather than dysfunctional, because when we get so attached to one way of doing things that we don't see alternatives, we can actually become over dependent on this method, and we just refuse to see other ways of solving problems. And because of this, psilocybin, as irrational as it might seem, can actually make people more rational in the long term, because they're now able to widen their toolkit. And Peterson's point was that this is not a scientific premise. This is more of a psychological way of getting people to explore the world, and that is a narrative. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. A couple of things. So the first thing is let's talk about the use of psychotropics. I don't myself, but I've studied it a lot. And an interesting, I have friends on the Navajo reservation who've talked about problems with alcoholism, and they've tried numerous approaches to help treat people who suffer from alcoholism. And they said the approaches that they use, the traditional Western approaches they use, don't work very well. There's an enormous amount of relapse. And trying to talk people out of alcoholism doesn't seem to work particularly well either. Some people can manage to use those methods, but most can't. But they've had enormous success with peyote. The use of sacred rituals, especially if the person was raised in a traditional Navajo context, in which the sacred traditional Navajo teachings have a deep emotional connection for the people. If you take them through a traditional Navajo ceremonial, like the night chant or the enemy way or what have you, and you mix that with the use of the Native American church's peyote, it allows people to have a profound, using the terminology you were just using, a profound right brain experience that allows them to effectively, break out of the trap that they've been in and start over. And the people I talk to, they've done this themselves and with members of their own family. So it's got empirical backing to it. They've actually had the experience you're talking about, where this non-rational approach allows the person to become what a modern might call more rational, in the sense that they're no longer a practicing addict. It's fascinating because it's one of those kind of paradoxes where, in the modern world, we have defined rationality as the source of all good things and irrationality as the source of all bad things. And yet through rationality alone, we can't seem to help break certain irrational patterns in our lives. But through irrationality, sometimes we can break those irrational patterns. All of this stuff sort of points to the idea that the modern conception of the relationship between rationality and irrationality and how the mind works, it might be broken. We might be seeing it wrong. Our definitions and categories might be wrong. And that might explain why, we're not able to produce the results that we believe we ought to be able to, according to the models that we're using. The second point that I want to make about what you're saying is, part of what this project is about, that this seminar is about, what this book is about, is trying to learn to see each of the worldviews of three different epochs: the ancient epoch, the medieval epoch, and the modern epoch, not through modern lenses. That is, not merely projecting upon them what we want them to be or what we imagine them to be, how we would interpret them to be. We're trying to get out of that modernist trap. We're trying to get to where, rather than always being a prisoner of the modernist worldview and having no choice about whether or not to interpret the world that way, we want to see if we can develop the ability to shift between at least 3 different worldviews: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. And doing that requires learning not what we imagine polytheism would be like to us, what it means to us, but what did it mean to them? How did they interpret polytheism? So one critical element of that is, to the ancients, the purpose of a god was not to be admirable. And I'll just let that sit for a moment. It wasn't the purpose of one of these polytheistic deities. They didn't exist in order for us to admire them and yearn to be like them. That's more of a medieval idea. It's more of a medieval idea that God is all good and, we should be as close to Jesus as we can. That's not an ancient idea. That wasn't the purpose of religion to the ancients. To the ancients, the purpose of religion was, we live in a very complicated world. It's effectively infinite by comparison with our short lives and our short time to learn about it. And we need help figuring out which are the parts of the world we better pay attention to. Because if we don't pay attention to those parts of the world, they're going to sabotage us. The story of our life will end up being about whatever it was that we were neglecting. So, for example, when a modern imagines polytheism, we imagine it as a menu. Pick one. What's your favorite? Or if you've got time, maybe you could pick 2, if you're extra gluttonous for religion. But we think of it as a monotheistic polytheism, right? Where here's a menu and you pick your monotheism off the menu. But that is not at all what it meant to the ancient Greeks. It was the opposite of that. To the ancient Greeks, you have to respect all the gods. And by respect, we mean the kind of respect you have for an 18-wheeler on a freeway when you're a kid out there playing marbles. You better watch the 18-wheelers and get out of their way or they're going to run you down. So the ocean, death, war, all of these things are gigantic forces of human life. And if you don't pay attention to them, whatever you thought your story was going to be about, whatever you planned for the story of your life to be about, it's going to get sideswiped by one of these giant forces that you were ignoring because you didn't pay attention to it. So the purpose of the polytheistic ancient Greek religion, according to the ancient Greeks, was to give you a roadmap of the most important things to keep your eye on, and to try to learn some of the ways and the patterns of the ways in which they affect us so that you know what to watch out for. The classic example, which everybody who's been on this call for a while knows, but I'll share with you, is the story of Oedipus. And the way moderns interpret the story of Oedipus is, here's this icky story about this guy who killed his dad and slept with his mom. Ick. That's gross. What an icky story. Don't be like Oedipus. But that's not at all what it meant to the Greeks. The story of Oedipus to the Greeks was a story about the smartest, cleverest, most virtuous person in Thebes. He's a hero. He's got everything going for him. He's an admirable person. He's an ideal that you strive to become like. The tragedy is that because he's human, he's finite, which means he doesn't know everything. Just like us, he doesn't know everything. And the one most important thing he doesn't know, just one little detail about his life he doesn't know, who he really is, who he was really born to, who his parents are. Just missing only that piece of information is enough for him to make of his life not just a mistake, but the worst possible series of mistakes. The things that the Greeks hated above all things, the things that they're like, I would rather die than have this happen to me. It happened to him, despite the fact that he had all the virtues going for him. He was only missing one little thing. So to the Greeks, the purpose of this is to try to teach you to be well-rounded, right? To look for what's missing in your life, to develop what's underdeveloped in your life, to make sure that, unlike Oedipus, you're not going to have this big blind spot in which an 18-wheeler is going to come in and clobber your life and turn the story of your life about the one thing that you were missing. Right? When we think of Oedipus, we don't think this is the story of a really smart guy, right? He was a really smart guy. He was the only guy who could solve the riddle of the Sphinx. And yet we don't think of him as the really smart guy. He was a really courageous man. I mean, at the ford, he fought against, the armed guy with his guards, who was stronger than he was, he fought and defeated that guy. He didn't know it was his dad. He was brave. He was just missing one piece of information. I am put in mind of there's a joke that goes around about a guy who did all these great things, but people only ever remember him for the one terrible thing he did. That's Oedipus. And that's what the Greeks are saying about their polytheism. You can't just say, well, I like beauty, so I'm going to worship Aphrodite. That's great, because all the things you're not paying attention to are going to clobber you now, right? You didn't pay attention to Ares, you didn't pay attention to Zeus, you didn't pay attention to Hephaestus. All of these things are going to be that's what everyone's going to talk about. They're not going to talk about the fact that you worship, Aphrodite. They're going to talk about what you neglected, because as Creon says in Oedipus, the hidden thing escapes, right? The thing that you the thing that you neglected, the thing that you overlooked, becomes what your story becomes about. So the ancient polytheism, you had to pay attention to all of them. And the paying attention wasn't supplicating or begging them for favors the way the medieval God became, or in the modern conception of God. It was about respect. It was about warning. It was about watching out, learning to be very cautious, like the way you respect a hot stove. That's how you respect Zeus. But you respect Zeus in terms of what is the role of authority in your life. You respect Hades and what is the role of death in your life, and so forth. Totally different concept of religion than what Jordan Peterson's talking about. That's the ancient perspective. That's not to say you can't have other perspectives, but if we want to understand what the ancient perspective was, if we want to be able to temporarily put it on like a hat and try to see the world that way and then take it back off and go back to seeing the world differently, then we have to be able to represent not what it would be interesting if they thought, but what did they really think? How did they really see the world? And that's closer to the ancient concept of polytheism than what Jordan Peterson's talking about. So Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, as I've listened, I'm not sure anything's on my mind. I made a bunch of notes and I look at them and I'm in distress.
Oh no.
But I am thinking of one line. If you're familiar with the Canadian show Kim's Convenience, at one point in there, it's about a Korean family that immigrated to Canada. But at one point, the mother in the family says, when they're asked something about some Buddhism or something, thinking they know a lot about traditional Korean religions, since they are Korean, she says, "Oh, we're not superstitious, we're Methodist." Well, the irony of that, anyway. I would recommend a book, Walter Kaufman's Critique of Philosophy and Religion, I think. It's a very, very good book. Takes up Buddhism, Christianity, and other things, other topics, what we think of non-religious. It could be the Greek view of religion, which he doesn't consider it's not religious in the same way that either Buddhism or particularly Christianity, Judaism. It's a good book. But what started me thinking was all this stuff about wisdom that I think we've kind of agreed here that it's sort of the guidance we need in the lack of knowledge. And that suggested to me, Hannah Arendt wrote The Human Condition, of which the third book was not written, but the first two on thinking and acting were, thinking yield sort of general rules, and what was it, acting? Thinking, willing is what we things we do. And that's where we apply the guidance that we might have gotten from thinking about a subject. But what didn't get written was judging. And that's something what wisdom is, the role that wisdom plays, in a sense. If we're going to apply rules to a particular case that's before us so that we know how to act, we have to be able to judge what case is before us. You know, and that's kind of, there's no rules for that. You know, you have to do it. And wise people get the case right. They know what they're being confronted with, even if they don't have all the rules to deal with it. And then I was going to try and say something about RK. And I don't know, everything I say about RK is going to be wrong, but
Do it anyway. Do it anyway.
well, RK are the principles of life, or organic beings, things that are organisms. I think they but so these as life, I think from the Greek perspective, things that are alive have soul, suke, an animating force, whatever it is. But some are we might not call them unconscious or pre-conscious or whatever, but they're still rule-based. And other things, living things, organisms, rise to consciousness. And we, maybe others, but we think we do, rise to self-consciousness, which opens up genotes seauton, that we can know some of the things, like, oh, what is it? The laws of the psychological. Are something that comes from self-knowledge, but there are still rules, and that self-knowledge is valuable. It allows us to, this is a big leap here. This gets us back to this. That would be a precondition for a value-based education, which was a topic you raised, which I don't know if I'm for that, against that, because No Child Left Behind easily gets opposed by No Child Gets Ahead. And I don't know, but if we were going to have a real value-based education, we'd need to try and create human beings who want to know themselves, because that's really the first step towards understanding how you would be treated, and how you would treat others. It's the beginning of shaping behaviors that allow you to have values. Now, there are other values about how you would treat other organisms that maybe aren't, they're not us. So we don't have that insight that comes from being one of them, that, oh, this guy kind of looks like me, so maybe he thinks a bit like me or has the same capacities. So, and if you all do that, and then in value-based education, what has always had trouble turning into what we should do. How should I act? We don't tend to think that so much in modernity, since so many scientists, that's what Kenneth has that word, scientism, where it's become a religion, and they don't respect its own beginnings or its own limitations. they don't subject themselves and what they're doing to the rigors of science itself. It's sort of but it's a unconscious method. You know, it has no reflectivity where it becomes aware of itself. So that's what I think. I think when we talk about RK, it's the rules that we don't discover through self-knowledge that guide, or I mean, even in ourselves, RK are present because they're in this pre-conscious life force that in our case gave rise to consciousness and to self-consciousness that allow us some glimpse. But while we can examine our own motives, the forces that are shaping our consciousness, we can't look in the same way into, well, how cell biology work. You know, we don't have any clue. We can sit and meditate all we want, and we don't, through knowing, through self-knowledge, self-consciousness, get to us the orderliness that's guiding our biological life instead of our mental life. Okay, that's way more than I was going to say. I'm going to go on mute as quickly as possible.
It's great stuff, Donald. Yeah, I think you were thinking of Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind, which has the section on one volume on thinking, one volume on willing, but she never finished the third volume on judging. And after she died, her assistant Jerome Cohn took her notes. I think she only had like a single sentence or something on the typewriter written, but she also had done a number of articles on related subjects, which, you know, he put together a collection of her articles that seemed to talk about judging, and edited them together into Responsibility and Judgment, which is sort of a posthumous approximation of a sketch of what the third volume might have been. But yeah, it's on my to-read list. I haven't read it yet. I've read The Human Condition, but I haven't yet read The Life of the Mind or Responsibility and Judgment. I really want to.
Yeah, but I think collect myself a little bit that this judging is the most difficult.
Yes.
And the most related to wisdom.
Yes.
Of what am I dealing with here, so that I know how I can use the rules or the things I've come about by thinking to decide how to will in this case. And I wish she'd have finished that book.
I know, right?
Yeah, but that may be foolishness in itself, you know, that, oh, if only I could find the right book. I would find myself in a find the right book. That's the
yeah.
That's the Argentinian, the Library of Babel.
Yes.
You know,
Borges.
well, there was Borges, right? There are lots of books that'll almost get you there, and there are plenty of books that it's searching for an infinity within an infinity.
Yes. Yeah, you know, so that collection of volumes is on my list. Very close to that, this weekend, I was digging through files I have from Kenneth Smith from some years back that he's written on the issue of the three character types, the douloi, the Banausoi, and Aristoi. Piles of files. I found piles of files. And it all started when, you know, I had in my head this idea that he had published his definitive treatment of those things in a series of 5 columns called Human Natures. But it turns out Human Natures barely touches on that subject. He talks about modernity, and somewhere in the 4th or 5th installment, he sort of briefly mentions the 3 types, but it is not his definitive treatment of those 3 types. So I'm like, I would swear I've read it. I said to myself Saturday morning, where the hell is it? So I started searching my disk drive, looking to see what I had. And I found when I went out and visited him back in 2006, he'd let me copy off a bunch of files off his hard drive. And I had a whole bunch of files about douloi, banausoi, and aristoi from what I think must have been a class that he taught. I think he taught it to David Roel, and that it was recorded, a seminar on Kenneth Smith's human character types. But he had a whole bunch of different files, some full of quotes, some of them full of little parables he'd written, some that were just about one of the types, some that put them side by side and did comparisons. And
I have a collection of half a dozen or so audio tapes of a weekend spent in when he lived outside of Dallas there.
Duncanville,
yeah. Well, that's, well, I'd have to listen to him again. I do have a cassette player.
yeah,
but not really.
Well, you can buy cassette to digital transfer machines. They're very cheap now, and they'll take things off of a cassette and put it onto your computer as an audio file. So you'll want to get yourself one of those. I picked one.
That way I could easily refresh my memory of what we discussed that weekend. It was 6 or 8 people. I remember a few highlights.
Yeah.
Where one guy I didn't know said, well, it's a good thing we're all aristoi. Which got one of those kerfuffles out of Kenneth. That
I imagine it did.
Yeah, right. We're all aristoi here.
How do you prove that you're not an aristos? By claiming to be one.
It's a sure sign.
Sure sign. It's like, oh, is that the best? Well, that must be me. I must be the best. It's like, oh, that sounds banausic to me. You're a social climber. You just want to self-identify as whatever you think will get you the most rewards. It's like, you're
that makes me think that we did discuss character types at that weekend.
Yeah, I'd say likely. So I went looking for this stuff because I was thinking about today's session, and I was thinking about, we've talked before about the way that walking through these epochs of history and the different corresponding worldviews, this is sitting in close relationship to this existentialist tradition of the 3 character types, which goes back to the Greeks. And what I wanted to see is more tracing of where did he get these ideas? How much of it comes from Arendt? How much of it comes from Nietzsche? How much from Kierkegaard? How much from Hegel? How much from Aristotle? I wanted to see the lines of the developments. So I know that he basically says he arrived at it because when he spent time going through all these difficult philosophers, the shape of it just emerged from the things that they said, and that they sort of they had a harmonic field effect. The seemingly different philosophers talking on the same issues or related issues were generating this kind of harmonic field effect. But sometimes he says that, sometimes he says, oh no, these are the terms that the Greeks used. And yet if you read the Greeks, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Like Plato sometimes uses 1 or 2 of these terms in some of his essays. So I wanted to find that, and sure enough, among the files, he had one that was full of quotes where he was quoting other philosophers. It wasn't complete. The version I have from 2006 has headings for a bunch of later philosophers with nothing in them. So I got to call him up and see if he ever went back and filled that in. But when we eventually finish Millennia and Microcosm, I think we already agreed we want to do the human character types stuff from Kenneth Smith. It really informs the reading of this book, the more you know that stuff, or at least if you know Kierkegaard or Hegel and their take on these faculties, the more it informs this reading. It's interesting stuff. But yeah, I mean, this is part of what he's arguing here, is he's Kenneth Smith saying about this subject of wisdom, that many, many things are called wisdom by people who claim to know what wisdom is, and they're mostly wrong. Mostly they have the idea that wisdom is the good thing. They want to have the good thing, so they define wisdom as something that they have. And so as a result, the most benighted people in the world feel competent to tell you what wisdom is. And by coincidence, it's themselves or someone they admire. What a coincidence! Who could have foreseen that? It's rare to find somebody like Heraclitus who says, "Oh no, it's something hardly anybody has, and if they have it, they only have a tiny amount." Heraclitus's line on this is, "Only the divine nature has real understanding. The mortal nature doesn't have it." And he also says, "Human beings lack real understanding." And he's using terms that also mean wisdom here. He says, "Only what surrounds us has wisdom." And in here, he's alluding to the idea that the logos of nature, that from which the archae express the patterns that emerge in nature all around us, there is some kind of deep existentialist wisdom built into the structure of nature that far exceeds our petty attempts to be wise. And so when he says, wisdom is knowing how all things are steered through all things, that's why he's alluding to these archae, because it is the archae that are steering, navigating, cyberneticizing, the details of nature to produce the effects of nature. And where mythos comes into play, just to go full circle before I call on Phil, is the other Heraclitus lines where he says that there's not only a nature around us and outside of us. It's not only that has archae and character, but also the nature inside of each one of us. We have our own character made up of archae, and that characteristically produces our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings. And it has so much authority over us in the ancient divine sense of the term that you might as well call it a god, a daimon. That's how powerfully it rules us, every bit as much as powerfully as Aphrodite rules attraction or Hades rules death. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to say that I mostly agree. In fact, I deeply agree with what Donald said. But there's one point I will say maybe I disagree, and is that you should be glad that she never wrote the book on judgment. The reason why is that if she had wrote it, it would be a knowledge in which you cannot judge. You could just follow. So that's a contradiction right there. In fact, I think I was going to make a comment like earlier when you were talking about judging and all that. I said, "Oh God, you sound like a legalist." Because the Chinese has a form of legalism that was not necessarily benign. They saw it as a way to entrap people into doing what they want them to do by producing the carrot and the stick, and they followed that, and that then you'll judge them in relationship to rules that they set up. So not legalism is not necessarily good either. I want to say, in spite of the fact that I agree with all that, I want to make a hypothetical argument in favor of Seth. Okay. We know the battle between Osiris and Seth, although there was never really a battle. It was just Seth and then Osiris' son, Horus, who battled Seth. That perhaps what Seth was doing was to build a fortress for civilization to section itself off from nature, or you could say archae. And you could sort of see how this would go, because what distinguished human beings, or let's just say mankind, maybe a human being is too highfalutin, mankind from other beasts and nature in general, is we have a way of thinking that has to do with instrumental thought. In other words, making things, doing things, starting with splitting the stone and making it a weapon. That was the first fortress that we made against nature to protect ourselves. And then we developed civilization. And you notice early civilization, they all had walls around the city, right? It's a defense. So all of this is the instrumentality that ended up instrumentizing a kind of equipment that sections us off from nature, because we don't know nature well enough to protect us. So as we get into the modern world, we have become so instrumentalized in this sort of equipment. We pile equipment on top of equipment until we become ourselves part of the equipment. Think of yourself working in a factory. You are part of the equipment. So you become further and further distance yourself from the real term of relating to what the real is, because the real has become instrumentalized as equipment. And I think that this becomes a problem because we are constantly dealing with that, right? Everything is, we got rules, we got this and all that. All that do is that we no longer have room left actually for real judgment. That's why when you go to school, they don't want you to think. They don't want you to make judgments. They want you to follow the rules. A kind of indoctrination into the world of equipmentality. And I think, as I think about this, I'm thinking my original thought about art was correct, because I always thought it was a relation between art, philosophy, and the human spirit. Because what art does is the ability to use the equipmentality to explore the unknown in terms of questions and making judgments. And I also appreciate the fact that I always knew that art never gave you the answer. It just gave you a part of the answer. And you have to now use your judgment to decipher what the hell does this mean, right? It left itself open for the real essence of confronting the infinite, if you want to put it that way, or nature, or thinking, something beyond what's already written down in the rules. And I think we tend to forget that in a sense, that creative act is in a sense deeper, because it's creation that allows you to evolve into something different. So I'm glad that judgment is still left undefined. So you actually have to make a judgment. If it's defined, you are not making a judgment. You are just reading the sentence as legalism will have you do. That's it. That's the part I disagree with you. I am very glad that she never wrote that book. So you can ponder it, and she lets you make your own judgment. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah. And Kenneth says that, Hannah Arendt is just a really interesting philosophically to read, that she comes at things from a particular angle. She finds unifying themes in the original material and applies them to the modern world in very interesting ways. He says, and she writes clearly, but she doesn't go far enough. The thing that he finds problematic in Hannah Arendt is that she never goes as far on the subjects as he wants her to go. He says she stops short. And part of that is because of what her goals are in writing and who she's trying to appeal to, and which writers does she respect so much, which writers and thinkers does she respect so much that she doesn't want to write something that they would criticize. She wants to write something that they would feel like she argued it well. And so she's not willing to reach that extra step. And then she's also a modern. So frequently in her writing, she will, in one breath, critique major problems of the modern world, like she does in Jerusalem, Eichmann in Jerusalem, or like she does in The Origins of Totalitarianism. But then she'll turn around and try to define those things as aberrations rather than as indicative of the modern world. That is to say, she does that thing moderns do where they say, well, the Nazis aren't really like us. Stalinist Russia isn't really like us. They're trying to push away those things. And by doing so, it results in a failure to understand fully how the threads and principles within them that led to evil outcomes also run within us and would cause us to do evil things without us, in part because we refuse to acknowledge those things that work within us. We insist on scapegoating and othering. It's the modern reflex. And I always see that when I read her, but I also see the other part, which is, her ability to really, in a clear, calm, and yet, what do I want to say, uncompromising way, point out the things that we don't like to talk about. It's like, I really like her writing on it's in The Origins of Totalitarianism that she basically puts reason on trial. And she says, yeah, we like to say that the Nazis and the Stalinists, that they're totalitarian because they're emotionalist or subjectivist or irrational. And she says, we're all wrong about that. That's absolutely not the problem. The problem is that they're very logical. They set up a premise and they start following the premise, and where anybody else would say, oh no, I'm not going to purify my population by putting people in concentration camps and eliminating them. The Nazi says, well, I have to. That's the logic of my argument. I have to follow wherever it leads. If this means I need to purge 1/10 of my population, then so be it. That's the logic. I have to follow the logic. And as a result, she got a lot of heat from her intellectual friends who did not like the idea that reason could be the source of anything bad. And she's like, yeah, that's an issue. All right, so let's go back to the text. So with this kind of conception of the mythic mind having discovered the logic of the psychic, that a myth is not a lie, a myth is not a tall tale or a fable, a myth is not a defective scientific theorem, and most things that we call myths, like urban myths, are not myths at all under the ancient perspective, right? Using the ancient definitions of these words, none of those things are myths. It's not a myth unless it is unforgettably and unmistakably explicating the logos of the psyche. It has to be showing you the relationship between character and fate. Like Heraclitus says, character is fate. It has to be showing you why did this story have to happen to Oedipus? Why is it his story? Why is it not a coincidence? It's not just that the writer was being mean and made him not know these things so that he could get to the outcome. It's that not knowing these things is the producer of terrible outcomes. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else. Learning to see how, as to use terminology Phil used a month ago, I think it was Joseph, that history is it's a complex dance between agency and contingency. It's not merely wanting something enough and trying hard enough, and it's not merely fatalism and everything just is foreordained and comes out however it's going to come out. We are neither 100% helpless nor 100% in charge of our destinies. Both of those simple-minded modernist answers are bullshit. The truth is a very complicated dance and tug of war between agency and contingency, and that we neglect either one at our peril. Whatever we don't pay attention to is going to become the story of our life. We can have all the virtues but one, and that one virtue we're missing is what our story will be about, because that's going to define where we go, where we went awry. So with that in mind, now let's do this paragraph again, and we can, I think, move on to the rest of the section after this. Like a prehensile organ, myth gathered into coherent handfuls, the psychically colorful issues of human existence. So, you know, a couple of things about that. We're talking about myth as an organ, which means we're talking about myth as an organism. And this fits what we talked about before, that the ancients didn't see the cosmos as made up of objects or mechanisms. They saw it as made up of organisms. And the default metaphor for anything, even a text, like a myth or an idea, the default metaphor is not, that's a thing that we possess. The default metaphor is, that's an organism, it's alive, and it wants to go on living. And it's going to interact with our minds in organic ways, with or without our permission. That's, you know, very different conception of the world. Certainly a very different conception of abstractions. We think of abstractions as related to information, which we think of as data, which we think of as passive. You just put it on a shelf, there's my datum, and when I need it, I'll recall it, right? We think the will has all of the activity, and the information is all passive. And in this, we're mimicking the God of Genesis. We want to be the source of all spirit, the source of all activity, and we want the world to be passive matter that we're going to form with our will. And so we imagine that we can have ideas in our heads and stories in our heads, and that they just sit there and do nothing without our permission. But the ancient Greeks naturally believed that the mind is at work without our permission, and it's busy interacting with all of these things like myths and stories and ideas. And that when we're asleep or when we're thinking about something else, the back of our brain is busy changing without our permission. It's developing into something else. It's growing. It's going through a metamorphosis. And we may not know what it is that we're becoming, but whatever it is we're becoming, we're already the seeds of that. We're in a process of unfolding and changing. So he also says, like a prehensile organ. And this is the allusion back to what he says: self-consciousness, self-awareness, philosophy is an unnatural act for a human being. It is a kind of turning back and looking backwards upon oneself. The eyes normally look forwards out into the world. We pay all this attention to what's in front of our eyes, and we don't pay any attention to what's behind our eyes, because the eyeball can't rotate 180 degrees in its socket. So there's something unnatural about applying our mental capacities to assess our mental capacities, right? We're turning to look at ourselves and what it is that we're doing when we're looking and thinking and conceiving. Or as Kenneth Smith says, equally important, what we're doing when we don't notice something, what we're doing when we suppress something from the picture. What is all of that unconscious stuff that's going on? It says this requires the ability to reach into places one can't normally reach. For Van Huyn's benefit, another metaphor he uses is like the shoulder, and how it has a limited range of motion unless you dislocate it. And if you dislocate it, although it's painful, you can sometimes get your shoulder to move in ways it can't at all move when it's in joint the way it's supposed to be. And so he talks about the act of self-reflection and self-analysis as a kind of dislocating the joint of the mind, so that it can not just reach out into the world and analyze other people and other political parties and trees, but it can reach into yourself and analyze, well, what about where you came from and how you're assessing things. It's a painful, unnatural, but important act. So like a prehensile organ that's gathered into coherent handfuls. And this is why there's polytheism, right? One handful is Zeus, one handful is Athena, one handful is Apollo. It's like all these related issues get grouped together under a rubric, a set of rubrics and a name and some characteristics to make them memorable, psychically colorful, right? They stand out. And also psychically colorful because these are things that can't be quantified. They have to be qualified. Why does this person have the ability to learn from his mistakes, while that person refuses to learn from their mistakes and will only try to defend himself, try to say, oh no, I didn't make a mistake, or if it was a mistake, then somebody else made it, not me, or I had my reasons, anything but learning from it. Why does one person go one direction and the other person goes the other direction? It says these are things that can't be quantified. They have to be qualified. And color is an example of something that, you can say what the wavelength is of the color, but that doesn't do anything to help you understand the difference between blue and red in an experiential, emotive, memorable way. The moment you make it colorful, it sticks. And the moment you start dealing in colors, you get the ability to represent things that otherwise couldn't be represented. So we're talking about psychically these issues of human existence. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean? Who are we? What is our life like? What can we expect out of life? These things, he's saying, these aspects of human existence are bound to the psyche, our mind, the nature of our character, our specific constellation of principles at work. That's the stuff. That's the agency picture, right? Half of what we're putting out into the world is this stuff that comes out of our character. And as the Greeks make clear in the earlier sections we talked about, even though that is our action in the world, it comes out of this character, because we don't know ourselves, an enormous amount of what we're doing is invisible to us. A lot of the decisions we make aren't being made consciously. In fact, most of the decisions we make aren't being made consciously. They're being made by our unconscious. If we knew our character, we would start to be able to predict, what the rest of our character is up to when we're not paying attention. That organism of the mind squirming around in the dark doing stuff, we might have we might be less self-blind, and we might, as a result, be better able to trace the extent to which some percentage of the problems in our life are being created by ourselves, even though it's not being created by our own will. So we need that ability to map our psyche, to map these qualitative features of it, and to map them in a small enough number of ways that we can remember them and keep track of them and start to anticipate them. And until we do that, we're more like symptoms of our culture and character than we are like individuals, right? Like, I was born into an alcoholic family. I've got the genes. If I start drinking, I might never stop because it's not up to me voluntarily. It's part of my character. It's baked in through my genetics. And because I know that, I don't have to find out the hard way. But my wife, she doesn't have the alcoholic gene. Her family, it's not a thing. She can, we can go out to dinner and she can have a glass of wine with it, and that's it. She doesn't then go home and drink down a bottle to finish it off with, and then drink a bottle every day after that. She's able to, engage in moderation as part of her life in a way that her character permits, but my character does not. If I didn't know that about myself, I'd be like my grandfather, who drank and drank and drank and drank, who made a mess of his life out of alcoholism. Knowing our respective characters, we can know that Beverly can drink and I can't, and then we can go on leading our lives and have a certain amount of choice and individuality and free will, and not just be a symptom of this thing that was baked into me genetically. All right, so he's saying there's a lot at stake, and it affects everything, right? Because we're human, and because these things have this authority over us, like Heraclitus says, like a daimon, like a god. He then says, talking about myth made it possible to think in terms of principles and concepts, to modulate one's way out of merely personal or phenomenal ways of experiencing. So he's talking here about, how do you get beyond the immediate stimulus of life, which otherwise, as we've talked about before with the live wire metaphor, it's pretty all-encompassing, right? I mean, somebody pisses you off, your anger rises, and it dominates. It becomes your God. Suddenly, you feel obliged to act on this anger, unless you have a broader context that you can bring to the picture and say, is this the first time I've been angry? Am I sometimes angry like this when I'm wrong? And maybe instead of being angry, I should shut up and listen. Is there a bigger picture here that I can use as leverage so that I'm not just possessed by my feelings or by my immediate experiences? Can I see the larger picture? Can I see the patterns? Can I see the principles? Can I work out the concepts and say, this is one of those subjects other people don't get so angry about. And maybe, in fact, there's not a real good reason for me to be this angry. Maybe I should shut my mouth instead of opening my mouth and just swallow my anger. Note it, not forget it, but swallow it and let the conversation continue without me having to blow up like a little bomb pointlessly, like I did the last 40 times this subject was raised. Can I stop being a symptom? So this is part of what when you think about it in these terms, the ability to see past the surface phenomena of life to the larger patterns and the deeper principles. The claim that myth made it possible to escape the parochial trap and begin to see the larger picture. Right off the bat, this is not a sentence any modern would write. Moderns think myths are lies. Right? A myth is a popular tall tale. It's a fable. It's garbage. It's nonsense. It's obsolete. It's been replaced by science. The myths don't have anything good about them. I mean, maybe you could write a book of myths and make some money. Maybe you could make a movie about want to make some money. But other than that utility value, a myth is worthless and they're dangerous, right? This is the modern conception of a myth. So we can see in this how alien the ancient conception of a myth is. That not only does it have a value, it has the most important value for the human condition. The ability to get out of the parochial trap, which is the problem that afflicts every single human being. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but we got hands, so go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you said, I think you emphasize something very important in the text. And that's a relationship between the inner, interior, inside, and the outside. How to make a judgment about that? I have a more fundamental question that's related to that. I mean, it actually is the basis that builds that. We have our senses. Our senses do not experience the world as it really is. As an artist, I'll take color as an example. I know that red, blue, yellow, all that, and all the mixture in between, all of that is like, does not exist in the world. It's a transliteration of what the world might be, if we actually believe in electromagnetic waves. So at least in that sense, it's not a one-to-one equivalence. And we would be different animals, we would be different species, if we actually saw electromagnetic waves as they really are. The question I have is this difference a delusion or a surplus? Because I could see it either way. Like, as an artist, I see it as a surplus. It adds something to the world as it is, right? I mean, I have art, all the beautiful colors in the world. You tell me they don't exist. Okay. All right. I'll even buy it to that degree, but it certainly exists in my experience, okay? Taste in general. I mean, sounds. There are waves in the air and so forth. But I hear them as tones. I experience them in music. All that we develop as let's say, as a secondary effect becomes a very rich part of our lives. Taste. I have taste for certain foods. I mean, let's just take that away and just eat the gruel. It will make you healthy. I'm sure it will make you healthy, but it's just that it doesn't have the same kind of surplus appeal. So all these senses, it seems to me, it adds to the world that we're in. But I could see that it could be a delusion. So, I mean, what is it? Is it like half and half, or what's the deal? I guess if I hear, well, actually, in some ways, I like atonal music, but if I hear atonal music, a dissonance, supposedly is this way, but I'm making a judgment that may not be real because atonality exists in the world. But I prefer the tonality. Okay. So yeah, I want you to answer that question. Is it a distraction or is it a surplus? An added value. You pay extra for the meal that has color and taste. You pay extra for the painting that's not just black and white, but actually has beautiful harmonies and color. So, I mean, this is a tough question. I mean, how much should we respect this sort of like divergence from the reality? I mean, it somehow shows us reality, but it's not the same. So could you say something about that? Because I'd be interested to see what your judgment is. Talk about, and you don't have to read the book of judgment, just make up your mind.
So, you put me in mind of the peacock mantis shrimp, in the cat, and the way that it can see so many colors we can't see, like an unbelievable number of colors. And they're not irrelevant because the peacock mantis shrimps, on the one hand, use them themselves on their own bodies to send information to each other. And also they can look out at the other fishes and the other things that are moving around them and see qualities in those animals that we can't see. They're invisible to us. We look at a fish and we think we know what's there, but we don't notice the things that a peacock mantis shrimp notices. The way that they can see polarized light, and not just one kind, but linearly polarized light and circularly polarized light. As if that wasn't enough, they're looking at things like in whole dimensions beyond the way that we see. And their vision is so much better than ours, it's almost as though we're just blind. The simplest way to explain how much we're missing is that we're blind by comparison with them. And have you seen those photos of starlings under UV light? Starlings to us look mostly black, maybe with a few dots, but under UV light, have these spectacular colorful patterns, unbelievably beautiful. They're not a black bird. They're a bird of many, many colors that we just happen to be unable to see. And of course, they have those colors for each other because they can see those colors, right? It's just we who are denied access to that. And, our reaction when we first see those depictions of a wildly colorful patterned starling, or another classic example, what's in right now is not showing true color photos of Jupiter. I don't know how long it's been since a true color photo of Jupiter, was all the rage on the internet. We're crazy for the false color images that illuminate the different wavelengths of the different elements so that you can actually see into the structure of Jupiter's clouds. The great red swirl becomes this huge, spiral of amazing patterns that we can't see with the naked eye. It's only visible, to someone who had the ability to see these missing wavelengths that are outside our experience. The reaction that human beings, and this goes right to art, and I'm about to talk about art, right? This goes right to the way that, incredible works of art draw the human eye. And we don't just passively analyze objectively a piece of art and go, it's very interesting. 60% blue and 30% green and 10% black. Oh, nice. This is not our interaction. Our interaction is, ah! You look at Guernica and the screen comes out of the window and reaches halfway across the painting. And so that you're seeing a sound, right? And the first time that somebody gets what they're looking at, their reaction is, oh my God, that's they didn't even imagine that before, but now that they see it, they can't unsee it. And it pulls on them. There is this element in which in our lives, familiarity denies us the live wire experience of immersion in the world, right? That we had when we were newborns. When we were newborns, our problem was we couldn't stop reacting to everything around us, right? Everything was hypnotic. And we've developed our noetic mind through distancing, through negation, as Hegel says. We've pulled more and more of our will and our attention out of gnosis to buy ourselves the space in which to theorize and plan and predict and start developing a coherent, structured life. But it comes at the cost of cutting us off from the juices of life that a newborn is directly in touch with. And of course, the newborn, even at his juiciest, the newborn is still wildly cut off from the experience a peacock mantis shrimp has looking at the exact same thing, right? There is this way in which
I just Googled starlings. Even if what we don't see, it looks pretty amazingly colorful to me.
right?
Even at the rate what we miss.
Yeah, they're amazing.
They look beautiful.
They're amazing. And I remember it was about 2 years ago when I found out that a lot of people on this call had never looked closely at the Mandelbrot set, the fractal. And it's it's based on a simple equation. Simple relation. And so I shared this video, and I just shared it in the link again. It's about 9 minutes set to classical music of a deep dive into the Mandelbrot set, you know, and it's just hypnotic. All those colors, all those patterns, as you go deeper and deeper into the patterns shift, and yet they reappear again in new forms and new aspects. And that's very like the experience mathematicians have noted for a while. It's very like the experience we have in nature, where we keep seeing spirals and we keep seeing spheres and we keep seeing all these different patterns, except every time we see them, they're a little different than the last time we saw them. And so they have a little bit of the shock of the new, right? That jars us out of familiarity and back into appreciation. And that balancing point between, are we wholly hypnotized and unable to look away? Or are we wholly complacent because we've seen it a million times and now we're unable to see what's right in front of us because it's old hat? Or can we find that spot in the middle where it draws us just enough that we can simultaneously still exist as a will and while also being pulled towards it? Now, art really wants to occupy that middle zone where the work and the observer are pulled into a dance, and neither one wins, but they both interact. The effect on the human mind of being in that state is really quite profound and difficult to characterize, but it goes right to the heart of all this stuff we're talking about in Millennia and Microcosm, and when we talk about the Hegelian faculties of the mind and so forth. And we're seeing them at work at moments like that. And the more often you look at the Mandelbrot set, the less of a revolutionary effect it will have on you, because you've got familiarity. It stops surprising you. It's why I particularly like this 2016 9-minute version, because it goes deeper than most of them do. And of course, in the Mandelbrot set, the whole point is the farther you go, there are new things to discover. And yet the new things still echo the patterns that you learned before. So it keeps you right on that knife edge of familiarity versus novelty.
Well, it's the same thing. What I call an elevator. If I hear Beethoven, it really pisses me off.
Well, bad news then about the music to the Mandelbrot. Anyway, thanks for bringing it up, Phil. Stephen and then James. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I was just talk about one of my observations, which is probably quite common, but looking into history, I mean, we take the term Greek and we're referring to Greeks of a certain time as well as the spatial concept. As a jumping off point, there are the Greeks. And that's the way we tend to look at things when we look at history in a very simple, grade educational way. That, there were the Egyptians and they were really great because they came up with, the fundamentals of building big structures and irrigating fields and all that groovy stuff. But of course, they were into all that nonsense, superstition, mythological stuff, but they did have their good points. And of course, the real stuff that came along was the intellectualism of the Greeks. We're starting to get closer to perfection, us. But what people don't tend to understand when they think of the Greco-Romans and everything that was going on with the Greco-Romans, that it was already there with these people we call the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians. These Babylonians and Assyrians weren't the Babylonians and Assyrians of 1,000 years earlier. These were a new deal. These were very much in common with what the Greeks were and what the Romans were to become. They were developing sophisticated things. So the thing is, with the existence of the Phoenicians, we're starting, well, trade had occurred, but we're starting to have the beginnings of world trade. This is where trade, look at how trade, you know, we've got all the shipping containers on the docks. We're dominated by it. Well, trade was starting to become a big thing in that era which followed the Phoenicians. That era where we had all the famous kings of the Bible, you know, David, Solomon, Ahab, and the whole lot, which the biblical scholars are so in love with. And then we have somebody like the Assyrians who come along and try to establish an empire which involves polyglot peoples. And the Assyrians are unusual, is that, well, not absolutely unusual, but they try to create uniformity in their own way. They capture the gods. They take the gods back to their capital. They capture the leading people. You know, when they talk about them carting off peoples, it's believed that they're really talking about the ruling elites of each culture. We're going to take you back and we're going to make you part of our empire, and you're going to have to fit in and join in. Now, this is the thing, that trade's a material thing. People love material goods. They love buying stuff. But this ancient mystery tradition was on a collision course with this material culture, because the ancient mystery tradition didn't pay the due respects for mercantile concerns. When you look at the monotheistic religion, it's a massive benefit to the mercantile mentality. It's the KFC of religion. I can go to some far-flung place and I know exactly what to expect. There's no great difficulties in translation. I'm a merchant. I want to get through the whole place quickly with as little trouble as possible. So please give me the one-stop shop for religion. I can't spend the whole week going and looking at every god. I'll go there on Sunday, Saturday, whatever, bow to the gods, follow the rules, and then I want to spend the rest of the week doing my business. So this one stop, we do everything in this religion. We do your brakes, we do your windscreens, we do the lot. No need for, you know, going around to the different things all the time. And this, so my point is, this conformity, the ambition behind this conformity was making the world a safe place for mercantile trade. This is why empires exist, is the advantages of having one authority over the trade rather than what was, say, happening in Gaul in Caesar's time. You'd go to one tribe with your trading goods. Oh, we'll take a certain amount of that. Next tribe, we'll take a certain amount, and by, you know, before the merchant's gotten too far, he's broke. And of course, the imperialists realise, well, if we want to make things work, we can only shave so much off the merchant. We want to keep the business going because the business is good. The Western Roman Empire probably fell more than anything, is that there was no longer the trade valuable enough to protect. Their trade had broken down. So this is why empires exist, to protect the trade routes. And what happened in that whole Middle East as these huge empires developed, eventually the Persian Empire followed on, the Babylonian Empire and all that. And Greece was one of the few parts of the civilized world that fell outside the reach of this empire. So this is a curious question. What happened to these mystery cults? It declined in the face of trades and mercantile activity, which suited rational intellect. Somehow that ancient culture, which we don't understand, we condemn it as silliness, but we don't really understand that there might have been something sophisticated beyond our wildest dreams occurring in these ancient mystery cults. You know, we have the temple sleep, we have people being put into a morbid near-death experience. They were doing all sorts of crazy stuff, which seem to have practically vanished later on. We do not understand this. And that's a big problem as far as I'm concerned. It's really been ignored. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the push for uniformity, it's been a bigger effect on us than we're willing to acknowledge, because we want to believe that we're the first free people that ever existed, that we're not uniform, that we're all exactly who we want to be, that we were able to self-actualize and become, you know, whoever pleased us to be. And but that requires that we conspicuously fail to notice how much we are like everybody else, you know, how mass-produced we are. And one of the things that I was reading about this weekend when I was going through Kenneth Smith's other works on human characterology is that he repeatedly talks about this issue of, in the same way that the medieval epoch's attempts at genocide were limited by their technological incompetence, that they just lacked the ability to impose their religion on everybody else. They tried, they wanted to. In fact, they thought it was their duty under God to eliminate all other religions. But despite all the will in the world, they couldn't pull it off. But in the modern epoch, we were able to have genocides on a scale they couldn't conceive of, or that they could only dream of, because we now have industrialized power. We have this ability to mass produce results in a way that no previous epoch could do. And, you know, what he's pointing out is that that applies to the mass production of people. We can mass produce personalities that each of whom swears it's an individual, while all living almost exactly the same life as its neighbors. Well, you know, there are differences, but they're like the difference between preferring the color blue or the color purple. Who cares? That's not the stuff that matters. You know, you're not going to find substantive differences between one person and another in the modern world to the extent that you used to in the ancient world. When we talked about the medievals previously during the introductory, in chapter 3, I think it was, and one of the things that we talked about is, you know, that the medieval Christian European milieu, despite the fact that they were obsessed with stamping out heresies, new heresies cropped up faster than they could get rid of them. You know, they came out of the gate from the Roman Empire with one orthodoxy and, you know, 11 heresies riding side by side. You know, they weren't unified to begin with. And by the time we get to the end of the epoch, it's the same thing. It's an orthodoxy that's corrupt and no one trusts anymore, and 11 heresies running side by side, except now they're all declaring themselves, you know, independent versions of Christianity, perfectly legitimate. You know, all 1,000 years of concerted effort failed to bring about the level of uniformity that we can do now. It's truly strange. So, you know, the McDonald's metaphor, I think, is a good one. Thank you.
KFC, actually, but McDonald's will do.
KFC.
Well, who came first, McDonald's or KFC? McDonald's.
I don't honestly know. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
McDonald's, Stephen.
Yeah, could you say that that this, you know, this what you're talking about is really a kind of a repetition of these errors, right, in history? And is that what myths are supposed to teach us? You know, that you know, like the myth of Sisyphus and Oedipus, and that you know, it's this idea of repetition, right? We're making the same errors. You know, Oedipus is about fate, and if you're not conscious enough to of that myth, then you are going to repeat, you know, the same fate as Oedipus. And the idea of the unconscious, Freud's unconscious, is this kind of is this idea of repetition of the same structure of human life, right?
Right.
That you're going to repeat the same thing, same fate, and this kind of psychological these psychological fallacies, you know, in life will be repeated.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
No, that's a
you
good
know,
point.
unless you become conscious of it, and so there is a kind of unconscious, like you were talking about, you know, not repeating the same. Anyway, yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
It's an excellent point, James. Yeah, that there's basically that we can change our political leaders, we can change our economy, we can change our cultures, we can even change our epochs, but we don't change the fact that it's still us going through the experience of life in each of these periods. And you know, we're a particular kind of animal with particular kinds of strengths and weaknesses that are characteristic of our species. And what to a modern, the word characteristic means, you know, it's sort of like them to be that way. But of course, to the ancient Greeks, it means it is our character. It's our fundamental nature as lawful and authoritative over us as the law of gravity is over our bodies. And so, you know, we can either go into each election or economy or culture or epoch armed with an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses that we're carrying with us, and in which case we might be able to compensate for them somewhat. Or we can go in blindly believing that, you know, we have an inalienable rights to life, liberty, and universe and happiness, and that we don't have to work for them. We're born free, and we don't have to try to be free. We're born objective. It's our birthright as a modern to see everything exactly the way it is. You know, God bless us. We're the scientific ones, the smart ones, the educated ones. And if we do that, if instead of going into it with caution and self-awareness of our issues, if we go into it blithely and full of confidence and arrogance, then we will just end up replicating the same errors that people have been making for hundreds of thousands of years. Or we might make worse errors because people in the past might have been more cautious about themselves than we are. So they might have been less likely to make the enormous blunders that we can now make on, well, now that we're mass producing personalities, we can make them now on global scales that people before didn't even dream of, didn't even know there was a world that big. So it's an excellent point. You know, this issue of, does history repeat itself, or do historians just repeat each other? You know, this is, you know, a big part of this is, it's like the problem, and I go back to this over and over as a personal issue. It's like the problem of being an alcoholic. You know, I'm born with alcoholism. If I know that, I can do something different. But if I don't know it and I deny it, then that archive within my character is going to keep pushing me in certain directions every time I'm acting, right? These archive work that make up our character, they are at their most powerful when they are overlooked. You know, when we don't know that they're there, so that we can't take them into account consciously. We can't do anything about them. Then we become merely a symptom of them, right? And the more that we're just a symptom of some baked in static part of our character, the more we end up having stereotypical repeated behavior. That somebody who isn't in the trap that we're in could look at us from the outside and say, does he even know the way that he's caught in a loop and just keeps acting out the same things? And of course, the answer is no, because that's the unexamined part of my life. In that part of my life, I'm not free.
Right. So would you say that the Duloi and the Banalsoi are really characters that represent this kind of repetition of the same error?
Yes.
And the error story is a kind of a self-consciousness of those characterizations that are also within the error story, but he represents a kind of overcoming or rising above or surpassing that kind of repetition
Yeah, that's
by
right.
by being self-conscious.
That's right. It's not that an Aristos eliminates it, but that an Aristos has harnessed gnosis to noesis so that they act as checks on each other. So from time to time, unlike a doulos or a benausos, from time to time, Aristos will look up and go, I've done this before. Holy crap, I'm repeating myself. Why am I repeating myself? This kind of self-criticism makes it possible here and there from time to time for an Aristos to break out of their pattern within their life. But we don't get to see much of that in the modern world because Aristoi are suppressed characterologically.
Yeah, so that's what myth really teaches us, right? If you understand myth and you understand something about yourself as a kind of a repetitious character in life, you're playing roles, on the world stage, and that and you could be playing those same roles repeating over and over again, unless you become aware, and then you could play a different role, right?
Yeah.
And
James, this is right on. I mean, I haven't thought about it before from the perspective of escaping cycles of repetition, but you're right. That's really central to this, isn't it?
Yeah. Like this myth of Sisyphus isn't that about a character who's rolling the rock up the hill and up the mountain, and he's repeating that same thing over and over again, unless he becomes conscious.
That's right.
That he is this absurd character.
That's
and
right.
That's where he gains his freedom, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the story of Oedipus doesn't change until he finally clues in what's been happening. Why does he keep repeating mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
What's the missing piece?
I think Kierkegaard also, he has a whole section on repetition. I think that's what he's talking about too, that the different stages of life, aesthetically, ethical, are really for him repetitions of the same kind of roles in society. And he wants to rise above that, and where he can take this leap beyond those repetitions.
Yeah, to date, I've read about Kierkegaard more than I've read Kierkegaard, and I want to change that in this coming year. I want to really go through either or and some of his other works in detail. Or that's part of why I didn't pick up on this theme of repetition from Kierkegaard. Thank you for bringing it up.
You and Eric Christensen from Chicago should get together. He's a Kierkegaard expert. He's been doing meetings on Kierkegaard and Kant for about 10 years, apparently. Yeah.
I have a on my to get list from Kenneth Smith is a set of tapes from a Kierkegaard class that he did for David Roel, and Kenneth said he'll make me copies and mail them to me, and then I can go through his big Kierkegaard class. I really want to. I know Kierkegaard is a hugely formative influence on Kenneth Smith's philosophy, and you've caught me from time to time referring to him, but I don't go into nearly as rich a detail on Kierkegaard's influence as Kenneth Smith now as I will, say, a year or two from now, once I fully immersed myself in it, so I could start to spot the connections. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. And thanks again to James.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I want to thank Stephen for talking about materialism and the I guess the unification of material and trade routes and all that. I just want to say in passing, before I address the other issue, is Barbara Kruger, a sort of a contemporary artist, did this very, very important piece called "I Shop, Therefore I Am." I've seen people who scolded her as if she actually believes in that, but that was actually a criticism, right? That this sort of belief in materialism, and material has turned us all into kind of slaves. We are acting out the story of shopping, and that is the meaning of our life. It's become the religion. So I think in that piece, it's a very simple piece. She actually not only took down Adam Smith, but also Descartes. And so in some sense, it's very important. It really goes all the way back. And thank you, Stephen, for giving me the history of the trade routes and all of that. And there is something to that, though. I mean, we all need materials to a certain degree. So I mean, it's almost something that it's an easy trap. It's like animal trap. You lay a trap, you put some meat or some delicious stuff in there, you got them. So we're not that different from a wild pig or something. The other thing I want to mention is I was, as I have said, in the last several weeks, I've attended this thing. It's been held twice, called about the parallax of Antigone. I was first surprised to find out that Antigone was the classic play of Sophocles more than Oedipus the King.
Mhm.
Until maybe in the late 19th century toward the 20th century, when Freud really brought that up and emphasized that. So that's interesting. I mean, I never thought of it that way. That's very important. And this particular interpretation is really, really radical. I'm not sure if I agree with it, but it sort of says something. We uncovered something very interesting. The bearing of the brother against the authority of the state. I've always interpreted as the relationship between the divine law and the human law. I still believe that. But it was saying that it was really a political struggle between the family and and Creon, the king, the uncle, the king. And what we uncovered was that Antigone, in the final analysis, when I guess Creon said that you're breaking the law of the state, she essentially accused Creon that the state's law is actually creating a civilization where the state is the last barbarian.
Mhm.
That in order to create the law, you have to be the last cannibal, and said, I'm no longer the cannibal. I am creating law, which creates this thing. And it's really quite a radical notion, maybe that's what it is that we had to eat our predecessors in order to become civilized, which is very interesting. Now, maybe that's not literal in the sense that, they actually had the munchies. But there certainly is a thing that even every generation had to a degree negate its previous generation and to move on. So the metaphor, at least, and I think that meant more than a metaphor, the metaphor, at least, is that, yes, for the process to begin, you have to, in a sense, negate the previous. And if you take that in a radical term, that is cannibalism. Defeat the enemy, eat them up, start a new dynasty. It's like, yeah, I'd say, wow, that if you see it that way, acting out literally politically in the play, and I think the Greeks might have saw it that way, is that it really becomes a revolutionary theater,
Yeah.
rather than just a relationship with the divine law, cosmos, and the legal law.
Right.
So I wanted to mention that because, God, that makes that play a revolution, right? accusing the state of violence.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, no wonder. I mean, it's like if it remains alive today, that somebody could retrieve that and throw that into, in a sense, reinterpreting or maybe authenticating Antigone, then that is really reviving Antigone to its radicality. I never quite saw it to that degree of radicality. I thought it was more, that's a bit more of aesthetic distance, but that really brings it up close. So I thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you for that. You're making me really want to reread Antigone now. I mean, I need to read it and look for that in it. I think I've been overlooking.
You sure you want to be the last cannibal?
Oh, hells to the yes.
I did that play when I was in college.
Nice.
Yeah, I did.
Who'd you play?
Antigone.
Oh my goodness. You were the star.
No, I didn't play Antigone, but I played Antigone's mother.
Oh yes. Oh, that's a nice role. Excellent. Well, with that in mind, let's go to the next sentence of the essay. So he says, instead of merely feeling, the mythic mind, and of course, as I mentioned before, it's instead of merely feeling or thinking, instead of merely engaging in gnosis or merely engaging in noesis, the mythic mind was prepared for seeing the order of its world and its own self. It was prepared for that. It was that, in other words, that objectivity doesn't come for free. You need to develop the capacity to see reality more like what it is, because otherwise the natural disposition of your two basic faculties is to misinterpret the world in one of two characteristic ways, either overly parochially and experientially on the one hand, or overly ideologically and abstractly on the other. And those become gravity wells for us if we're not careful, if we're not prepared to see past those obstacles to our perception. And that the purpose of myth is to break up the stony ground of our minds, which are inclining one way or into one of the two traps, and to get us to be fertile again, to be able to comprehend what it is that we're looking at. And by that, we put it together with the other sentences, he means specifically to be receptive to the things that matter most, right? That you won't look at the scene and miss the most important parts of it. The myths prepare you to notice the most important parts so that they jump out at you. So that your 7 plus or minus 2 parts of your brain that can consciously pay attention to something, they're not just going to fixate on random little details of parochial or ideological interest. They're going to gravitate towards the big themes from Antigone and Oedipus and the Oresteia and the Iliad, the other things that are going to help to draw you into, oh my goodness, that person has a temper. Oh my goodness, that person is possessed by an ideology. Oh my goodness, I am really upset about this and it's making me not think clearly. There's these ways in which the exposure to myths and the consequences of people's character that we've been immersed in and leading up to the point of perception prepares us to be able to get over our various obstacles and to notice more of what really matters in the situation. So this is what he means when he says, instead of being blindly vulnerable to psychic forces, that is, instead of unconsciously gravitating towards the liabilities of one or the other of these two faculties that we naturally gravitate towards, the mythic mind, the mind that has been prepared through myth to perceive the world, it discovers the logic of the psychic. It discovers the ways in which our preconceptions preoccupy us and block our access to reality. And so this is what he means by the psychological here. So you see how this all reads very differently. Now that we've gone through the last 2 months of exploration of mythos and logos, the stages of mental development. Yeah, happy Thanksgiving, Sharon, and so forth. That's the new information comes out of the sentence and we get closer to what he meant by it. In other words, we've sort of, in a rational, intellectual way, done a little bit of mythic breaking up of our own minds so that our encounter with this text is able to let more of what he's actually trying to say through than we would otherwise have seen. This is very analogous to what he's saying that the mythic mind does for us when we encounter any other part of reality. So he writes, Hegel saw all human life and cultural history. Right. So here again, we have the way in which Hegel follows the Greeks in saying that culture, there are analogies between, and they're not just analogies, there are parallelisms between culture and what it does, and an individual mind and what it does. And like Hegel will later say, there are similar parallels between the structure of the different faculties of the mind on the one hand, and then the different character types that precipitate out of the habit of gravitating towards one or another faculty, right? So the faculties generate these patterns of thinking, which generate these characters, which in turn generate, the behavior, the shared behavior of the people in a culture, which in turn generate cultural history. So all human life and cultural history are marked by a teleological insurgency. A teleological insurgency. An insurgency is an uprising, right, against the established rule. And in this case, the established rule in a human life is your own will, what you consciously are planning to do. And what he's saying is there is this uprising, in which your unconscious revolts against your conscious and forces you to do things that your will had no intention of doing. And in that, it can feel to the will like a betrayal, just like a ruler is pissed off about an insurgency. To your will, it's a betrayal when you find yourself trapped in these cycles of behavior that you never wanted to get into. Where is this stuff coming from? But as he says, it's not a random insurgency, it's a teleological insurgency. There's the teleology is that it was always there in your character, the seeds of this behavior. It didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't a coincidence. Your own character and archive were pushing you teleologically in a direction. Even though they couldn't set a specific outcome, they could move you in a direction. So whenever you weren't consciously resisting it, that's the way you would drift. And this is where knowing yourself or not knowing yourself plays such an enormous role in whether or not you just capitulate to that drift and become a symptom, or whether you can understand the tendency to drift that way and start to do something about maybe not drifting that way, so you can be more than a symptom. Hegel saw all human life and cultural history as marked by a teleological insurgency, the rise of consciousness from a state of merely implicit self-apprehension to explicit comprehension of the self. That is, rather than just experiencing what it's like to be you and just sort of going along with it, right? You're familiar with the feeling of being yourself. This is the implicit self-apprehension of the self. So you rise from that basically unconscious experiential level of being yourself to an explicit comprehension of the self in which you have begun to model what your self is and how it behaves. You've begun to model your own character and watch for the evidence that would tell you what archive are at work within you. What are the patterns, the unconscious patterns you're seeing? When does your unconscious mind override your conscious mind? Where is its real strength? What's the real juice down in your unconsciousness that can charge you to do something, even though consciously you never would have picked that choice? In so doing, you start to get a sense of the relative strengths of the different components of your character. And from that, sort of a shape of who you are internally that you otherwise wouldn't have. And based on that, you start to comprehend what you're likely to do in a situation. Another way to say this is, in the same way that the first time you watch Star Trek, you don't know who any of these people are, but you gradually start to figure out that the calm, logical one is going to end up being Spock, and the excited, emotional one is going to end up being McCoy. You start to be able to predict it because you've watched them from outside enough. You've watched their behavior, and you've watched the consequences of their actions from their beliefs being tied together in the structure of these mythic stories. That creates the possibility of predicting the future and thus having a choice. So Mythos is teaching you how to do that in general, but also specifically so you can apply it to yourself. So that rather than the self just being an unconscious experience that's always present like water in your life, the self becomes a character who you can learn about in the same way that you learn about Spock or Kirk. And in learning about them, you begin to be able to better predict the behavior of the otherwise invisible unconscious. See, there's this illusion that gets created by the structure of the human mind. Some parts of what you think are visible to you. To be conscious, it means that that part of your mind is visible to you. And the illusion is you can come to believe that you only consist of the visible parts, that things that aren't visible don't exist, that that's just the blackboard on which your conscious behavior has been chalked in. And what myth teaches us is that that's absolutely false, is that the vast majority of what's going on in your head is never visible to your conscious mind, but it's there anyway, and it's strong, it's powerful. Just like Spock may not know what he's going to do going into a situation, but if you watched enough episodes, you might be able to figure out what Spock's going to do in a given situation, because the invisible parts of Spock that he can't see for himself, you've learned to start to see into that darkness and predict what's in there. In the same way, you start to make visible to yourself the invisible parts of your own psyche and your own character. You become a character to yourself. And thus, as a result, you can start to guess where the story might be going for the same reasons that it works in a myth. This is what he's talking about here. This is what this explicit comprehension is. That it's not just a big invisible darkness. You start to be able to sketch in the stuff that's going on in there. And then he culminates this paragraph with two final sentences. And the first is, myth is the most pivotal and vital step in any culture's learning to encompass the order that encompasses its feeling psyche. That is, beyond what you feel and experience about yourself, there is a larger picture of who you are that includes all this invisible stuff that you didn't notice and that you didn't feel, but that has at least as big and most likely a bigger impact on what you're going to do. So you're learning to mentally, experientially encompass not just the conscious parts of yourself, but the unconscious parts of yourself, the whole picture of yourself. And that's where individuality and freedom start to develop. Before that, you're just a symptom of whatever is in you. But after that, you could start to make decisions about what's in there. So this is why he says it's the most pivotal and vital step. Until this happens, a culture is unconscious. It's barely even a culture. You know, it might be a pre-culture. It might not be a culture at all. But the point at which it starts to remember this about human nature, the importance of this vast, invisible, characterological part in determining the course of human events, when it starts to realize that, and then it starts to figure out, how can I explain that to the next generation so that they're not as clueless and blind as I was when I started out, so that they can have a head start and they can get further than I got, right? They're not wasting so much time flailing around in the darkness, taking things for granted the way I was. That's the most pivotal step. Then the development of that culture really slams on the accelerator. It starts to have the ability to not make every generation relearn every lesson the hard way. Some of them you can learn the easy way and move on to more interesting new lessons the previous generation never got to. But you can't do that until you reach the stage as a culture where you are drawing people's attention to this critically important, difficult problem that all people in all eras always have, which is caused by the structure of their own consciousness. And I'll just wrap this up before I call on Phil here with this last sentence of the paragraph. Look at this. We finished the paragraph we've been on for 2 months. Through myth, humans digest the ineffable to gain a waking knowledge of their own dream life. So that intangible, invisible parts of yourself and the intangible, by extension, the intangible, invisible parts of your own culture, what it does and what's characteristic of it, but that it doesn't know about itself. You start to bring that into consciousness. And in bringing it into consciousness, you start to be able to draw conclusions about what's really going on, what its real strengths and weaknesses are, where it really needs change and where it doesn't, right? Those are the things, as they become visible, that start to create the possibility of freedom at an individual level and at a cultural level. Up until then, like Heraclitus says, we're all just basically sleepwalkers. We're not really conscious of why we do the things we do. We have a consciousness, we have a will, but we just assume that it's a free will. We assume that it's an objective consciousness that's seeing the world accurately, because nobody's ever told us that the peacock mantis shrimp has seen colors that exist but that we can't see. We don't yet believe in the invisible, let alone that it's important, let alone that it might be more important than what's visible to us. But once we get the ability to really consciously understand the nature of our dream life, why we're unconscious the way that we are, then we start to have the ability to do something about it and to change the human condition. All right, Phil, that's it for that paragraph. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this is beginning to sound a lot like somebody I don't like, because it's beginning to sound like Skinner. You know, I mean, except this applies to the unconscious. Skinner applies to the consciousness of others. I think that's the difference, but the methodology is still, for Skinner, others, which I don't agree with, is a black box. And so is animal studies, that, by the way, has a lot of the black box conclusions. And the thing he missed is that human beings seem to have ability for intersubjectivity, which he doesn't include. I guess maybe he's stupider than we think. But still, his methodology is similar in terms of detecting the unconscious in a funny way, right? It's like just by a kind of behavioralism. So, yeah. So, yeah, I appreciate that, but I also like, just because I don't like Skinner, it makes that sounds terrible when I say this is beginning to sound a lot like Skinner and behavioralism. So I just want to say that. If you want to respond, that's okay. If you don't, that's okay too.
Yeah, Kenneth Smith is definitely not a behavioralist.
Okay. All right, I agree with that.
Yeah, and part of it is that Skinner, as part of the 20th century, had this whole machine view of human beings, computer view of the brain, right? So it's just, if it's just a machine, you don't have to respect it. All you have to do is push its buttons correctly. That's the heart of behaviorism is we can control anybody and make them do anything as long as we push the right buttons. And that couldn't be further from the ancient worldview, which is that each person and each mind is an organism that is following its own laws of development. And there are a lot of limits to what you can get it to do that isn't within its nature. These cats, I can get them to do a lot of things, but they're never going to write computer software. It is just not in their nature. And it's not in their nature because they're inadequate. It's because the presence of their character as cats draws them to take interest in certain things. And those things are way too interesting in them to waste any time trying to program a computer. Why would anybody want to do that? It's not noticeable. And it's the same for us. We each have our things that we're drawn to or drawn away from. And, the tabula rasa idea that underpins behaviorism, at this point is basically disproven. People certainly have a lot of flexibility, but within that frame, what they can and cannot develop into isn't up to some external author to just sit down and say, I would like all people to be like this, and if I just hit them with a whip 20 times, then it will work. That's not how any of this works.
And
right?
marketing seem to do that pretty well, though. You gotta say.
Yeah, what's interesting about advertising in the market is that it works better than anybody thinks it does, So everybody thinks they're personally immune to advertising, and then they still go out and get KFC on the 4th of July, right? Even though they're immune. But
I shop there for I am.
right? I shop there for I am. Shopito ergo sum. But but on the other hand, it works less well than advertisers think it does. Because if it worked as well as everybody thinks it, as advertisers think it does, businesses would all succeed every time they advertised. And that's not what happens. Sometimes it succeeds and sometimes it doesn't seem to have a effect, or it's hit or miss. And sometimes it wildly backfires, and an advertising campaign can take down a company who didn't realize that nobody was going to like what they just did. One of the things I have a friend on Facebook who likes to share really uncomfortable ads from the 60s and the 50s that, like advertisements of how women will be your slave. Sometimes it actually literally the guy is sitting in a recliner and one of his feet is on the back of a woman who's on the floor scrubbing on her hands and knees. And there'll be some marketing slogan about, how to get her to do what you want. And you're like, now nobody would make an ad like that, right? It's the worst possible. It's like, how do you want to go out of business quickly, right? So there is this way in which, these things, it depends on the audience. It doesn't always go the way you want it to. And this is partly because of character. What are you receptive to and what are you not receptive to? What are your inner laws of growth and how are they going to respond to the contingency of this thing coming at you? Stephen, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, the question of Skinner, it's a bit interesting actually. Famously, he lost the argument with Chomsky. But I'm wondering, there's a sort of rational contentedness where Skinner, very, very empirical outlook. And my argument is the empirical outlook shouldn't be ignored. I think that it does have a big part to play, even though essentially Skinner was wrong. That there's a lot of details he's got which are correct and shouldn't be ignored. I keep on making this case with people when they ask what spirit is and what the difference between soul and spirit is. And I'll make the case that, look, you could be this person who's living in a hole in the ground and all you understand is what's going on there. Bug rolls in, you eat the bug, yum, yum, yum. And you can abstract that to thinking, gee, I'd like a bigger, better, and even tastier bug. But how much could you imagine beyond that? See, our spirit, our human spirit, is not an individual spirit. It seems to be subject to what Jung was talking about, the archetypes. A truly individual spirit could be down that hole in the ground and imagine a world beyond that without having to have the inputs. That's what I think spirit is, and I don't think it's very well understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that goes into some of what the ancients talk, what Kenneth says about the ancients in some of the earlier sections, and what he's also going to say in some of the lettered sections to come. The Greeks were obsessed with this concept of autonomy and autology, which is where your logos is not entirely outside of your will. It's not entirely imposed upon you either from without or from within, but instead you're sort of self-ruling and self-shaping your own character. That's where Heraclitus's character as fate takes on its really interesting dimensions. When it's not merely the static character you happen to be born with that's your fate, but rather the organism of character within you, which is changing and metamorphosing over time, and that whose changes can include changes that you put into it, right? That you can to the extent that you begin to understand your character, you can start to cultivate your character. And then you get very interesting, complicated relationships between free will and determinism in those cases. And what happens when somebody like that goes down into the Kafka's burrow is a lot more interesting than what happens when a mole is in a burrow.
Oh, is that what it's called? Kafka's Barrow.
Kafka, the burrow. Yeah. Yeah. Google Kafka, the burrow. You can read the whole thing. It's a short, it's not even a novella. It's short. And it's incomplete. It cuts off at a certain point. But man, what a depiction of the mole's view of life. Like you say, the tasty bug, where have I stashed my tasty bugs? And I just know everybody wants my tasty bugs. The mole can't imagine somebody walking by going, the last thing in the world I want is your tasty bugs. This is inconceivable to the mole. And thus it's completely paranoid. Everybody wants my bugs.
I think part of the problem, I think I noticed this very much in my own life, is everybody's looking for a universe that fits them. They themselves inwardly, I did get this from somebody else, are rigid. They don't really want to do the hard work of changing their inner nature. They want the world to do all the heavy lifting for them so they can just go on being who they always were, being leptors, like Kenneth has said. I'm not going to change. I want the world to change for me. I want the world to fit me, without ever doing the hard work that might go in the other direction.
Right. Exactly. And of course, they think that would be the best of all possible things. And they don't understand that it's the worst because it causes them to atrophy.
Does that mean that the person is a product of their circumstances, and so they change according to the circumstances? Then that's also a part of that myth of faith, and that's that you can learn from. But you could just be repeating the same story. But it's based on just your conditions. It's like a behaviorism. You're conditioned by your environment.
Well, there is that element that we have spoken about, and that is how humans differ from, say, animals, where we've lost some of the instincts. And this results in us experiencing an inner condition of emptiness, and we're condemned to be free. We're in this huge argument about free will and determinism. They do tend to ignore the question that we actually do face choices that animals luckily don't have to put up with. I mean, it's going to be far easier being a cat, like Rick Scott, I reckon, than being a human. I wouldn't be too challenged.
Yes.
But being a human's, you can tell the cat, don't try it. It's bad news. Just remain a cat.
Yes. Yeah. This is where things fell apart for the mechanistic worldview of human character, is the idea that we're infinitely programmable, which is what they thought, is a very different thesis than the idea that we are partly programmable and partly responding to our circumstances, but also partly responding to our own inner character. And that inner character might be out of sync with our circumstances. It might cause us to do things that nobody else under those circumstances would do, because we have to be true to our character. So this is where Joseph's line about the complexity of the relationship between agency and contingency comes into play. It's not just the contingency of our circumstances that determines what we'll do. And this is where the wisdom of Heraclitus comes in. It's the direct effect on what we're going to do is our character's response to that contingency. How does it feel about it? What is its reaction? And that's really hard to predict. That's now you're in, as Kenneth says, now you're into the ineffable stuff. No one's ever going to have a complete map of your character. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, as much as I like these, talking about Freud and Jung and Skinner, Kenneth once said that if you he had sort of a disdain for academic psychology. Probably still has it. Says if you want to understand human psychology, talk to a successful con man. He depends for his very existence on the ability to understand human psychology. Academics, they just don't have anything in the game other than a paper or some research or getting a grant. Talk to somebody whose actual physical existence depends on getting it right. And then you'll learn some psychology.
Yeah, I've heard him say that, and he's right on the money, right? And it's not the sort of thing that moderns like to hear. That a con man understands us better than we understand ourselves. We feel that we have an inalienable right not to have that be true. It's like, how can we be free if we're just walking rubes waiting for the con man to get us? That just doesn't seem right somehow. So we decide it must not be so. Well, so we've actually finished the paragraph after two and a half, 3 months. And I think with Mythos, Logos, and Suke unraveled the way we've done it, I think we'll find that the rest of chapter 4 goes actually fairly swiftly, because I think this was the hardest part. But we'll see if I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong and we'll bog down. But anyway, I hope you all had a good time. I did too. And thanks again to David for hosting these.